Welcome back to another deep dive into the twisted, blood-soaked lore of From Software's masterpiece, Bloodborne. Today, we're exploring one of the game's most tragic and compelling figures, Ludwig, the Holy Blade. This is the complete story of a hero who became a monster, a savior who damned himself, and a warrior whose greatest strength became his ultimate weakness. Before we begin, I want you to know that this journey will take us through the darkest corners of Yharnam's history, from the gleaming spires of the healing church to the nightmare-soaked depths where Ludwig's consciousness still writhes in eternal torment. We'll examine not just the facts of Ludwig's life and fall, but the cosmic horror that orchestrated his corruption, the legacy he left behind, and what his story tells us about the nature of heroism, ambition, and the price of power in a universe governed by alien intelligence. So settle in, because we're about to spend considerable time unraveling one of gaming's most elaborate tragedies. To understand Ludwig, we must first understand Yharnam itself. This wasn't always the nightmare-infested hellscape we encounter in Bloodborne. There was a time when Yharnam was simply another prosperous city, perhaps more affluent than most, built upon ancient foundations that concealed secrets far older and more terrible than its citizens could possibly imagine. Beneath the cobblestone streets and Gothic architecture lay the Thumerian labyrinths, vast networks of tombs and chambers carved by a civilization that had communed with beings from beyond the stars. These weren't mere burial sites, but sacred spaces where ancient peoples had performed rituals to contact cosmic entities known as the Great Ones. The Thumerians had achieved a form of immortality through their communion with these beings, but at a cost that had left their civilization as nothing more than undead guardians wandering forgotten halls. The discovery of these underground realms marked the beginning of everything that would follow. Scholars from Byrgenwerth College, led by the ambitious Provost Willem, began their excavations into these forgotten depths. What they found there would fundamentally alter the course of human history, the old blood. This mysterious substance possessed healing properties unlike anything the world had ever seen. Diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia could be cured with a single transfusion. The weak became strong, the elderly found renewed vitality, the blind gained sight. It seemed like a miracle, a gift from the gods themselves. But as with all such gifts in the universe of Bloodborne, it came with an inevitable and terrible price, one that would not become fully apparent until it was far too late to turn back. The old blood was not simply a medical marvel, it was a form of communion with the Great Ones, those cosmic entities that existed on scales of reality that dwarfed human comprehension. Each dose of blood ministration represented a step toward joining with intelligences that operated according to principles completely alien to human understanding. The miraculous healings were merely side effects of a much more fundamental transformation that was occurring at the deepest levels of biology and consciousness. It was during this era of discovery and mounting concern that a critical schism occurred at Byrgenwerth. Master Willem, who had initially championed the excavation of the labyrinths, began to understand the true nature of what they had uncovered. He recognized that the old blood represented not salvation, but a profound danger to humanity. His famous directive, "Fear the old blood," was not mere superstition, but a warning born of terrible understanding. His former student, Lawrence, saw things very differently. Where Willem urged caution and restraint, Lawrence saw opportunity and salvation. The old blood could heal any ailment, cure any disease, transform the weak into the strong. In Lawrence's view, to withhold such a gift from suffering humanity would be not only wasteful but cruel. What harm could possibly come from sharing such a blessing with the world? Surely the benefits outweighed any theoretical risks that Willem's paranoid caution suggested. This philosophical divide led to Lawrence's departure from Byrgenwerth and the establishment of the Healing Church. This new religious organization positioned itself as the keeper and distributor of the old blood's miraculous powers. They built grand cathedrals and established blood ministration as a sacred ritual, combining religious authority with medical practice in ways that gave them unprecedented power over Yharnam's population. The church's message was seductive in its simplicity. Through the holy blood, humanity could transcend its limitations. The sick would be healed. The weak would be empowered. Death itself could be postponed, perhaps indefinitely. All that was required was faith in the church and willingness to partake of the sacred blood. For a population desperate for hope in a harsh and unforgiving world, this message proved irresistible. But Master Willem's warnings proved prophetic. The old blood was indeed not simply a blessing. It was a curse disguised as a miracle, a transformation that began with healing and ended with horror. Those who partook of it found their bodies changing, twisting, growing. At first, these changes might be subtle: enhanced strength, improved health, a sense of vitality that seemed to defy age itself. People felt more alive than they ever had before. But as time passed, and more blood was consumed, the changes became more pronounced, more disturbing. What had once been human began to take on bestial characteristics. Bodies grew larger and more twisted. Bones lengthened and reformed into strange configurations. Hair spread across skin that had begun to thicken into hide. Teeth elongated into fangs. Most disturbingly of all, the rational human mind began to recede, replaced by something that hungered only for blood and flesh. This was the beast scourge, and it would come to define an entire era of Yharnam's history. The very people who had sought healing through the church's blood ministration were transforming into the monsters that now stalked the city's streets. The irony was almost too perfect. The cure had become the disease, the salvation had become damnation, and the church that had promised transcendence had delivered a form of devolution into savage, mindless horror. The church's initial response to the beast scourge was denial. They attributed the transformations to impurity in the recipient's weakness, of faith, moral corruption, or simple biological incompatibility with the sacred blood. The idea that the blood itself might be the source of the problem was too threatening to their entire worldview and power structure to be seriously entertained. But as the transformations became more frequent and more severe, denial became impossible. Something had to be done. The beasts had to be hunted, destroyed, removed from the streets before panic consumed the city entirely. This need for organized beast hunting would create the conditions for Ludwig's emergence as one of Yharnam's most significant historical figures, though the exact circumstances of his early life remain shrouded in mystery. As is so often the case with figures from Yharnam's history, we know that Ludwig appears in the historical record during the formation of the Healing Church. He may have been a scholar at Bergenworth himself, one of the early recipients of blood ministration who witnessed its effects firsthand, or simply a man drawn to the Healing Church's banner. What we do know is that his arrival marked a fundamental turning point in how Yharnam dealt with the growing threat that the old blood had unleashed. Before Ludwig revolutionized the hunt, the burden of dealing with the beast scourge fell primarily to the hunters trained by Gehrman in his workshop. These were skilled warriors, to be sure masters of speed and precision who could dance around their monstrous foes with weapons that transformed and adapted to any situation. Gehrman's hunters were artists of death, elegant and deadly in their execution. They fought with weapons that reflected this philosophy. The burial blade, which could sweep through crowds with its scythe form. The blade of mercy, twin daggers that rewarded lightning-fast reflexes. The saw cleaver and saw spear, versatile tools that could shift between forms mid-combat. These weapons required years of training to master, but in the hands of a skilled hunter, they could slice through beast hide with surgical precision. Gehrman's approach to hunting was deeply personal. He trained hunters individually, passing on not just techniques but a philosophy of the hunt. His hunters learned to read beast behavior, to exploit weaknesses, to turn a creature's own strength against it. They were specialists, each one representing a significant investment of time and resources. The training was grueling, and many aspirants failed to complete it, but those who succeeded became some of the most formidable warriors Yharnam had ever produced. As effective as Gehrman's hunters were, it became increasingly clear that a different approach was needed. The beast scourge was worsening, and the beasts themselves were growing larger and more numerous. Creatures like the cleric beast, massive amalgamations of flesh and bone that dwarfed anything Gehrman's hunters had been designed to face, were emerging from the ranks of those who had partaken too heavily of the old blood. The Healing Church, with its vast resources and growing influence, recognized the need for its own force of hunters. Not to replace Gehrman's workshop necessarily, but to supplement it with hunters who could tackle the larger, more dangerous beasts that were beginning to appear. More importantly, the church needed hunters who could be trained more quickly and in greater numbers than Gehrman's individualized approach allowed. This is where Ludwig's story truly begins. Appointed as the first hunter of the healing church, Ludwig brought with him a fundamentally different philosophy than what had come before. Where Gehrman's hunters were precise and methodical, Ludwig's approach was more direct, more forceful. He understood intuitively that fighting the massive beasts emerging from the scourge required weapons and tactics designed for a different kind of warfare. Ludwig recognized that not every hunter could be an artist like Gehrman's apprentices. Many would be ordinary Yharnamites, clergymen, citizens, volunteers who had answered the call to take up arms against the scourge. These people needed weapons they could learn to use quickly, weapons that would give them a fighting chance against foes that could tear them apart with a single swipe of clawed hands. They needed raw stopping power more than they needed elegance. Under Ludwig's guidance, the healing church established its own workshop, a massive circular tower adjacent to Gehrman's original facility. This new workshop represented more than just a departure from the old ways. It was a revolution in how Yharnam approached the problem of the beast scourge. The workshop's design philosophy was clear from the weapons it produced. The Kirkhammer, with its massive stone block that could crush beast skulls with a single blow. Ludwig's holy blade, a longsword that transformed into a greatsword capable of cleaving through the thickest beast hide. The hunter axe, simple in design but devastating in execution. These weapons spoke to Ludwig's practical nature and his understanding of the real-world constraints he faced. But the innovations went far beyond mere weaponry. Ludwig understood that weapons were only one component of effective hunting. He needed to transform the very concept of what it meant to be a hunter, to create not just warriors but symbols of hope and righteousness. The training regimen Ludwig developed emphasized several key principles. First, physical conditioning that could turn ordinary citizens into fighters capable of surviving extended combat with beasts. Second, weapons training that focused on techniques that could be learned relatively quickly while still being effective. Third, and perhaps most importantly, moral and psychological preparation that would help hunters maintain their humanity in the face of the horrors they would encounter. Ludwig trained his hunters to be what he called honorable Spartans, warriors who would stand against the darkness not just with skill and strength, but with unwavering moral conviction. In a world where the line between human and beast grew thinner each day, Ludwig's hunters represented the light that would hold back the encroaching darkness. They were taught to see their work not as mere pest control, but as a sacred duty to protect humanity from forces that threatened its very survival. One of Ludwig's most significant innovations was his emphasis on aggressive, persistent combat. He had observed something that other hunters had noted but not fully systematized. When wounded in combat, a hunter could recover health by immediately striking back at their attacker. This phenomenon, which became known as the rally system, seemed almost supernatural to outside observers. Ludwig appeared to understand this principle better than most. His discovery of the guidance rune, a Carol rune that appeared to him directly while holding the Holy Moonlight Sword, suggested a deep, almost mystical understanding of how hunters could push through pain and recover from wounds through sheer determination and continued aggression. He incorporated this understanding into his training methodology. Ludwig's hunters were taught to embrace wounds as opportunities rather than setbacks, to use pain as motivation for more aggressive attacks rather than reasons to retreat and heal. This philosophy of aggressive, persistent combat had both tactical and psychological implications. Tactically, it made Ludwig's hunters more effective against the large beasts that were their primary targets. These creatures possessed enormous health and resilience. A defensive, cautious approach would result in prolonged battles that exhausted hunters and increased the chance of fatal mistakes. But aggressive tactics that exploited the rally system allowed hunters to maintain pressure while sustaining themselves through the violence itself. Psychologically, this approach developed a particular mindset in Ludwig's hunters. They learned to see retreat as failure and healing as weakness. They were taught to trust in their weapons, their training, and most importantly, in their ability to recover from setbacks through sheer determination and skill. This mindset served them well against beasts, creating warriors who would press attacks even when wounded, who would stand their ground when others might flee. But this philosophy also had a darker side that would only become apparent later. The emphasis on aggression and the almost addictive quality of the rally system, the way it rewarded violent action with health recovery, created psychological patterns that made hunters more susceptible to blood drunkenness and eventual corruption. The line between necessary aggression and bloodlust became increasingly difficult to discern. The success of Ludwig's approach was undeniable and immediate. Under his leadership, organized hunts became common throughout Yharnam. No longer were the citizens helpless victims waiting for salvation from a handful of elite hunters. Now they could participate in their own defense, joining the church hunters in massive, coordinated efforts to cleanse the streets of beasts. These organized hunts transformed the social fabric of Yharnam in profound ways. They created a sense of community purpose and shared resistance against a common threat. The black garb of the church hunters became a symbol of both fear and hope, fear among the beasts and those who might become beasts, hope among those who still clung to their humanity. Ludwig had managed to unite the populace in a way that had never been achieved before, transforming the hunt from the work of a few skilled specialists into a citywide movement. Neighborhoods organized their own watch groups. Clergymen took up arms alongside laypeople. The aristocracy and the working classes fought side by side against a threat that respected no social boundaries. This democratization of the hunt had several important consequences. First, it created a deep pool of trained fighters that could respond quickly to beast outbreaks anywhere in the city. Second, it provided a visible demonstration of the church's power and benevolence, proof that the organization that brought the healing blood to Yharnam also possessed the means to deal with its unfortunate side effects. Third, and perhaps most significantly, it created a culture in which civilian participation in violent conflict was normalized and expected. The church hunters became a visible symbol of order in an increasingly chaotic world. Children wanted to grow up to be hunters. Young adults competed for the honor of joining their ranks. The black garb and silver weapons became iconic, instantly recognizable symbols of protection and righteousness. Ludwig had succeeded in creating not just an effective fighting force, but a cultural institution that would outlast his own lifetime. Perhaps Ludwig's greatest claim to fame, and the beginning of his ultimate downfall, came not from his leadership of the church hunters or his innovations in weapon design, but from his work as a tomb prospector in the chalice dungeons beneath Yharnam. The healing church made regular expeditions into the Thumerian labyrinths, seeking knowledge and artifacts left behind by that ancient civilization. These expeditions were dangerous affairs, requiring skilled warriors who could face not only the undead guardians that still walked the tomb passages, but also the more exotic threats that lurked in the deeper levels, where reality itself seemed to bend and twist under the influence of otherworldly forces. Ludwig was among the church's most accomplished tomb prospectors, venturing repeatedly into these dangerous depths in service of the church's mission to understand the cosmic forces that had shaped their world. The chalice dungeons were layered environments, each level deeper and more dangerous than the last. The upper levels contained relatively straightforward threats: undead Thumerians, beast-possessed creatures, environmental hazards. But the deeper one ventured, the stranger and more reality-defying the challenges became. It was during one of these deep expeditions that Ludwig made the discovery that would forever change his life and ultimately lead to his doom. In chambers where the very air seemed to thrum with arcane power, where the walls were covered in inscriptions that hurt to look at directly, where the geometry of the space seemed to shift when not directly observed, here, Ludwig found a sword unlike any other. The Holy Moonlight Sword appeared to be carved from some otherworldly material that seemed to drink in the darkness around it while simultaneously emanating a soft, ethereal glow. The blade had a translucent quality, as if it existed partially in dimensions beyond normal three-dimensional space. When moonlight, whether actual moonlight filtering through cracks in the ancient stone or some other illumination that resembled it danced around the blade, the sword would channel what its description calls the abyssal cosmos. This wasn't merely poetic language. The sword could literally hurl waves of shadowy light, beams of energy that seemed to originate from the spaces between dimensions. These attacks could cleave through solid stone as easily as flesh, and they carried with them a quality that defied normal physics. Enemies struck by the sword's energy waves didn't just take physical damage. They seemed to be partially erased from reality itself, their forms destabilizing in ways that suggested the weapon was affecting them at a fundamental ontological level. But the sword was far more than just a powerful weapon. Ludwig quickly discovered that it possessed something approaching will, consciousness, intelligence. When he held the blade and closed his eyes, he would see visions, tiny beings of light dancing in the darkness, offering what he interpreted as guidance. These visions weren't hallucinations or tricks of an exhausted mind. They were communications from an entity that existed partially outside normal space and time, an intelligence that had taken residence within the sword, or perhaps had always been the sword itself. The guidance Ludwig received from these visions was genuine and valuable. The tiny sprites of light would show him things. The location of hidden passages in the chalice dungeons, the weak points of particularly dangerous enemies, tactical approaches to seemingly impossible situations. When Ludwig followed their guidance, he found success. When he ignored them, he struggled. Most importantly, the visions emptied him of his fears. This was perhaps their greatest gift, and their most insidious trap. Ludwig's work as a hunter and tomb prospector constantly exposed him to terrors that would break lesser minds. The cosmic horrors lurking in the deepest chambers of the labyrinths, the nightmarish beasts that roamed Yharnam's streets. The knowledge of how fragile the barrier between humanity and monstrosity truly was, all of this should have driven Ludwig to despair or madness. But when he held the Holy Moonlight Sword and closed his eyes, the dancing lights would appear, and his fears would drain away. He felt confident, certain, capable of facing any challenge. This emotional support was invaluable for someone in Ludwig's position, but it also created a profound psychological dependence. He began to need the sword's guidance, to crave the emotional relief it provided. The sword became Ludwig's constant companion, though few outside of his inner circle ever saw it in its full glory. He was protective of it, even possessive, keeping its true nature hidden from all but his most trusted allies. To the general public, Ludwig's weapon appeared to be merely an exceptionally well-crafted sword, albeit one that seemed to inspire unusual confidence in its wielder. They had no idea they were witnessing a man who carried with him a fragment of cosmic power, a blade that connected him directly to forces beyond mortal comprehension. This secrecy was not born of selfishness but of instinct. Ludwig understood, perhaps not consciously but at some deep intuitive level, that the sword's power was dangerous. The visions it showed him were seductive, promising ever greater power and understanding for those brave enough to embrace the darkness it represented. Ludwig believed himself strong enough to resist this corruption, to use the sword's power for righteous purposes while maintaining his humanity and moral compass. Along with the sword, Ludwig discovered something else in those ancient depths. A Kerel rune that he called guidance. Unlike other runes, which were typically transcribed by the scholar Kerel from the inhuman utterings of great ones, the guidance rune appeared to Ludwig directly. It manifested as a symbol that represented the dancing lights he saw when he closed his eyes while holding the sword, a visual representation of the cosmic intelligence that spoke to him through the blade. This rune, when carved upon the mind through the process that Kerel had pioneered, enhanced the bearer's ability to rally, to recover health, by striking enemies after taking damage. The rune's description tells us that it boosts the amount of life recovered through rallying, suggesting that the sword was teaching Ludwig not just how to fight, but how to endure, how to recover from wounds that would fell other hunters. The rune's power wasn't merely physical, it operated on some deeper level, affecting the very relationship between the bearer's consciousness and their physical form. The discovery of both the sword and the rune marked a turning point in Ludwig's career. He was no longer simply the first hunter of the church or the founder of their workshop. He had become something more, a figure touched by cosmic forces, a man who carried with him artifacts of power that connected him to the very foundations of reality itself. The Holy Moonlight Sword's influence on Ludwig was gradual and subtle. It didn't immediately corrupt him or transform his personality. Instead, it worked slowly, imperceptibly, building dependence and trust, while gradually altering his priorities and perceptions. The entity within the sword was patient, understanding that direct domination would trigger resistance. Better to position itself as a helpful mentor, a trusted guide, a source of comfort and strength. And it worked. Over time, Ludwig came to rely more and more heavily on the sword's guidance. He consulted it for decisions large and small. He turned to it for emotional support during difficult moments. He trusted its visions more than the advice of human colleagues. What had begun as a partnership gradually evolved into something closer to servitude, though Ludwig himself remained largely unaware of this shift. The sword's description notes that it was Ludwig's true mentor. And this was precisely accurate. More than any human teacher or colleague, more than the doctrines of the healing church or the traditions of Gehrman's workshop, the Holy Moonlight Sword shaped Ludwig's development as a hunter and a leader. It taught him techniques, revealed secrets, provided insights that made him more effective than any ordinary hunter could be. But every lesson came with a price, though that price would not become apparent until much later. The sword wasn't teaching Ludwig to be a better protector of humanity. It was teaching him to be an effective agent for cosmic purposes that had little to do with human welfare. The visions that emptied his fears weren't simply providing emotional support. They were gradually eroding his human concerns and replacing them with alien priorities. One of the most insidious effects of Ludwig's relationship with the sword was the isolation it created. The guidance he received was, as the sword's description notes, of a most private, elusive sort. The dancing lights that brought him comfort and confidence were invisible to others, leaving Ludwig to appear to the outside world as a man who found strength in darkness and solitude. This isolation manifested in several ways. First, Ludwig found it increasingly difficult to explain his decisions and strategies to subordinates and colleagues. The insights he gained from the sword were often non-verbal, intuitive, based on perceptions that couldn't be easily translated into normal language. When asked to justify a particular tactical choice, Ludwig might simply say, he knew it was correct, unable to provide the kind of rational explanation that others expected. Second, the emotional relief that the sword provided made human relationships less necessary for Ludwig's psychological well-being. Where other hunters might seek comfort and support from friends or family after traumatic experiences, Ludwig simply consulted the sword. He became less invested in human connections, seeing them as unnecessary distractions from his sacred duty. Third, and most damaging, the sword's guidance began to conflict with human moral intuitions in subtle ways. The entity within the sword was pursuing cosmic objectives that operated according to principles alien to human ethics. When these objectives required actions that caused human suffering, the sword would present them as necessary, unavoidable, justified by cosmic imperatives that superseded individual welfare. Ludwig's growing isolation didn't go unnoticed by those around him. Fellow hunters and church officials observed his increasing tendency towards solitary decision-making, his reluctance to share his reasoning, his apparent comfort with choices that seemed cold or callous. But Ludwig's effectiveness remained unquestionable. Whatever changes were occurring in his personality, they hadn't yet affected his ability to coordinate the church's response to the beast scourge. If anything, his growing ruthlessness seemed to make him more effective at the brutal work of hunting. This effectiveness bought Ludwig time and credibility, allowing him to continue his work even as concerns about his mental state grew among those who knew him best. The church hierarchy, in particular, was willing to overlook his eccentricities as long as he continued to deliver results. They had invested too much in Ludwig's leadership and innovations to abandon him over concerns that remained largely speculative rather than based on clear evidence of incompetence or failure. But the seeds of Ludwig's ultimate corruption had been planted, and they were growing in the darkness of his consciousness, nurtured by the patient intelligence that resided within the Holy Moonlight Sword. Under Ludwig's leadership, the church hunters evolved far beyond a simple fighting force. They became a cultural institution, a symbol of hope and order in a world increasingly dominated by chaos and fear. The sight of hunters in their distinctive black garb, patrolling the streets of Yharnam, brought comfort to ordinary citizens, a visible reminder that someone was standing between them and the nightmare that threatened to consume their city. Ludwig understood that the psychological impact of his hunters was just as important as their tactical effectiveness. He insisted that his hunters maintain the highest standards of conduct, both in their professional duties and in their interactions with the civilian population. They were to be honorable Spartans, warriors who embodied the ideals of courage, discipline, and righteousness that the healing church claimed to represent. This emphasis on honor and righteousness was not merely cosmetic or propagandistic. Ludwig genuinely believed that maintaining high moral standards was essential to preventing his hunters from succumbing to the same corruption that claimed so many who partook of the old blood. He had observed that those who gave in to bloodlust and savage behavior were more likely to transform into beasts themselves. He was determined to keep his hunters on the right path through discipline and moral instruction. The training regimen that Ludwig developed reflected this holistic philosophy. Physical conditioning and weapons training were certainly important. Hunters needed to be strong, fast, skilled with their weapons. But equal emphasis was placed on character development and moral education. Hunters were taught to see their work not as violence for its own sake, but as a sacred duty to protect the innocent and preserve civilization against forces that threatened humanity's survival. New recruits learned the technical skills of hunting, how to read beast behavior, how to exploit weaknesses, how to work as part of a coordinated team. But they also learned about duty, sacrifice, and the importance of maintaining their humanity in the face of horror. Ludwig would often lead discussions about moral philosophy, about what it meant to be human, about the importance of fighting not just effectively but righteously. This approach to hunter training produced warriors who were not only effective in combat, but also capable of inspiring confidence and loyalty in the civilian population. Church hunters became natural leaders in crisis situations, capable of organizing and directing civilian evacuations when beast attacks occurred. They served as intermediaries between the church hierarchy and the common people, helping to maintain social cohesion during increasingly difficult times. The success of Ludwig's training methodology was evident in the esprit de corps that developed among the church hunters. They saw themselves not just as individual warriors but as part of a brotherhood united in common cause. This sense of shared purpose sustained them through the darkest moments of their careers, when the horrors they faced might otherwise have broken their spirits. The church workshop that Ludwig had established grew into a marvel of organization and productivity. The massive circular tower buzzed with constant activity as smiths, artificers, and hunters worked together to create the tools necessary for the ever-escalating war against the beast scourge. The workshop's design philosophy of standardization and mass production proved remarkably successful. The silver swords used in both the Kirkhammer and Ludwig's Holy Blade were nearly identical, differing only in minor details of length and crossguard design. This standardization allowed for interchangeable parts and simplified maintenance. A hunter whose Kirkhammer blade was damaged could potentially replace it with a component from Ludwig's Holy Blade or vice versa. This approach also simplified training, as hunters could learn techniques that applied to multiple weapons. A recruit who mastered the basic sword work needed for Ludwig's Holy Blade could transition relatively easily to using a Kirkhammer, as both weapons shared the same base form. This flexibility made the church hunters more adaptable and reduced the training time needed to produce effective fighters. The workshop also pioneered the mass production of firearms designed specifically for hunter use. Ludwig's rifle, named in honor of the first church hunter, featured several departures from traditional firearm design, a larger caliber and more robust construction than civilian weapons. These modifications were necessary to deal with the increasingly large and resilient beasts that hunters were encountering. Quicksilver bullets, infused with traces of the old blood, proved more effective against beasts than conventional lead shot. The mercury content of these bullets seemed to have a particularly deleterious effect on beast physiology, causing wounds that were slow to heal and appeared to cause the creatures significant pain. The workshop's production capacity for these specialized rounds was a critical factor in the church hunters' effectiveness. The establishment of the church hunters and the success of Ludwig's training programs had profound social implications that extended far beyond simple military effectiveness. For the first time in Yharnam's history, ordinary citizens could meaningfully participate in the defense of their city and their families. This democratization of the hunt created a sense of empowerment among the population. People no longer felt helpless in the face of the beast scourge. They could take up arms, join the hunts, fight back against the creatures that threatened their homes. This agency, this sense of control over their own fate, was psychologically crucial for a population living under constant threat. The organized hunts that Ludwig coordinated became community events, in a sense. Neighborhoods would come together, led by trained church hunters, to conduct systematic sweeps of their districts. These hunts served multiple purposes. They eliminated beast threats, they built community solidarity, and they provided visible demonstrations of the church's commitment to protecting its flock. The black church garb became a ubiquitous sight in Yharnam, a constant reminder of the organization and order that Ludwig had brought to the fight against the beast scourge. The distinctive clothing also served practical purposes. It identified hunters to civilians who needed help, and it created a sense of unity and shared identity among those who wore it. Children grew up seeing church hunters as heroes, as protectors. This perception shaped an entire generation's view of what it meant to serve one's community, to stand against darkness, to fight for something larger than oneself. The cultural impact of Ludwig's innovations extended far beyond the immediate tactical effectiveness of his hunters. By the height of Ludwig's career, the church hunting system he had created represented one of the most successful organized responses to the beast scourge that Yharnam had ever produced. Beast attacks, while still occurring, were being contained and managed rather than spiraling out of control. The civilian population, while certainly aware of the ongoing threat, felt protected and supported by the visible presence of church hunters throughout the city. Ludwig himself had become a legendary figure, spoken of in tones of reverence and awe. Stories circulated about his prowess in battle, his tactical genius, his apparently supernatural ability to face down the most terrifying beasts without fear. The common people saw him as their greatest protector. The church saw him as their most valuable asset, and other hunters saw him as an inspirational example of what dedication and skill could achieve. But beneath this surface of success and achievement, the corruption that would ultimately destroy Ludwig was steadily advancing. The Holy Moonlight Sword's influence had woven itself into every aspect of his being, so gradually and subtly that neither Ludwig nor those around him fully recognized what was happening, until it was far too late to reverse course. As successful as Ludwig's innovations were, they could not halt the inexorable spread of the beast scourge throughout Yharnam. If anything, the very success of the church hunters and their ability to maintain order in the face of growing chaos may have contributed to a false sense of security among the city's population. The availability of increasingly potent forms of the old blood, combined with the reassurance provided by the presence of skilled hunters, led many Yharnamites to take greater risks with their blood consumption than might otherwise have been wise. The healing church itself bore significant responsibility for this escalation. As the church's understanding of the old blood grew more sophisticated, they began developing more potent preparations that promised even greater benefits than the standard blood ministrations. Special blood reserved for church officials and their closest allies contained concentrations of power that could transform an ordinary human into something approaching superhuman capability. The temptation to partake of these enhanced preparations proved irresistible to many, including those who should have known better. Among the church hierarchy, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Those who had been most instrumental in building the church's power, the very clerics and administrators who had dedicated their lives to spreading the benefits of the old blood to humanity, were becoming the most monstrous when they finally succumbed to its corrupting influence. The cleric beast, that towering abomination of flesh and bone that would later terrorize the Great Bridge, was itself once a high-ranking church official who had partaken too deeply of the sacred blood. This phenomenon was not lost on Ludwig and his hunters. They began to observe that their most dangerous quarry were often former allies, men and women they had known and worked with before their transformation. The psychological toll of being forced to hunt down former colleagues and superiors was immense, contributing to a growing sense of paranoia and mistrust within the hunter ranks. The beasts themselves were evolving as well, becoming larger, more intelligent, and more dangerous with each generation. Where early beast transformations had produced creatures that were little more than rabid animals driven by hunger and instinct, the newer specimens retained disturbing echoes of their former human intelligence. These beasts could plan, could coordinate their attacks, could even use crude tools and weapons in some cases. Ludwig's response to these escalating threats was to push himself and his hunters harder than ever. He demanded more aggressive tactics, more daring operations, more willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of hunting objectives. This intensification of the hunt might have seemed like a reasonable response to a worsening crisis, but those close to Ludwig began to notice changes that suggested something more troubling was occurring. His attachment to the Holy Moonlight Sword became increasingly obvious and concerning. He was never seen without the weapon, and being separated from it, even briefly, would send him into states of agitation that bordered on panic. His fighting style became more aggressive, more focused on the devastating attacks that the sword made possible rather than the measured tactical approach that had characterized his earlier career. More disturbing still were the changes in Ludwig's personality and judgment. The man who had once been known for his compassion and moral clarity began to display a ruthless pragmatism that bordered on callousness. Decisions that once would have been made with careful consideration for their ethical implications were now made quickly, based purely on tactical advantage. The honorable Spartan that Ludwig had trained his hunters to be was slowly being replaced by something harder, colder, more focused on victory at any cost. These changes did not go unnoticed by Ludwig's contemporaries. German, the first hunter, is said to have made occasional references to Ludwig that suggested concern about the direction his former colleague was taking. Other hunters and church officials began to whisper about Ludwig's increasing isolation and the strange intensity that characterized his interactions with subordinates. But Ludwig's effectiveness remained unquestioned. Whatever changes were occurring in his personality, they had not yet affected his ability to coordinate the church's response to the beast scourge. If anything, his growing ruthlessness seemed to make him more effective at the brutal work of hunting down and destroying the creatures that threatened Yharnam's survival. During this period, Ludwig began conducting research that he kept hidden from the church hierarchy and even from his most trusted subordinates. His deep expeditions into the chalice dungeons became more frequent and more secretive. He would disappear for days or weeks at a time, returning with new insights into beast behavior and transformation, but offering little detail about how he had gained this knowledge. What Ludwig had discovered in the deepest chambers of the labyrinths had fundamentally altered his understanding of the beast scourge and humanity's relationship to the cosmic forces that governed their world. He had learned that the transformation into beasthood was not necessarily the end that it appeared to be, but rather a transitional state towards something potentially greater. The beasts that stalked Yharnam's streets were failed transformations, creatures that had been unable to complete the process of cosmic evolution. With proper guidance and preparation, Ludwig had come to believe it might be possible to achieve the benefits of transformation while retaining enough consciousness to continue serving humanity's interests. This revelation represented a fundamental shift in his understanding of his role as a hunter. Rather than simply seeking to destroy all beasts, he began to study them, looking for patterns and characteristics that might provide insight into the transformation process. He started conducting experiments on captured beasts, attempting to understand what had gone wrong in their evolution and how future transformations might be guided toward more desirable outcomes. This research required facilities and resources that could not be easily explained or justified through normal channels, forcing Ludwig to divert church funds and materials for purposes he could not fully disclose. The knowledge that Ludwig gained from these experiments was both valuable and corrupting. He learned to recognize the signs that preceded transformation, developing techniques that could potentially guide or control the process. More importantly, he began to understand that the boundary between human and beast was not as absolute as he had once believed. Under the right circumstances, it might be possible to cross that boundary and return, gaining the power of transformation while retaining human consciousness and purpose. This understanding led Ludwig to begin experimenting on himself. He carefully introduced controlled amounts of specialized blood preparations while using the Holy Moonlight Sword's guidance to maintain his mental stability. These self-experiments were incredibly dangerous, representing a form of deliberate flirtation with the very corruption that he had spent his career fighting against. But Ludwig believed that the potential benefits justified the risks, especially as the beast threat continued to escalate beyond the ability of conventional hunting methods to contain. The early results of Ludwig's self-experimentation seemed promising. He found that he could temporarily access enhanced physical capabilities that made him even more effective in combat against the largest and most dangerous beasts. His strength, speed, and resilience increased dramatically during these episodes, and his connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword became even more profound. But these benefits came with increasingly obvious costs. Ludwig's appearance began to change in subtle ways, his features becoming more angular, his eyes taking on an otherworldly gleam. His behavior became more erratic and unpredictable, with moments of brilliant insight alternating with periods of distant contemplation that left him effectively unreachable by his subordinates. More concerning still were the changes in Ludwig's values and priorities. The man who had once been known for his compassion and concern for individual hunters began to display a cold calculation that treated human lives as expendable resources. Hunting missions became more dangerous and less carefully planned, with Ludwig seemingly willing to accept higher casualty rates in exchange for more aggressive pursuit of beast targets. The other hunters under Ludwig's command found themselves in an increasingly untenable position during this period. They could see that their leader was changing in ways that were deeply troubling, but they also recognized that his tactical innovations and enhanced capabilities had kept them alive through missions that would otherwise have been impossible. Their loyalty to Ludwig was based not just on respect and tradition, but on the practical reality that following his lead was their best chance of survival in an increasingly dangerous world. This practical loyalty created a conspiracy of silence around Ludwig's transformation. Hunters who might otherwise have reported their concerns to higher authorities were reluctant to do so when it might result in Ludwig's removal from command. They convinced themselves that his changes were temporary, that the pressures of leadership and constant exposure to cosmic horrors would eventually ease, allowing the Ludwig they had known and respected to return. The church hierarchy also proved willing to overlook Ludwig's increasingly strange behavior. His continued effectiveness and the increasingly desperate nature of the beast crisis made them reluctant to take action. The church could not afford to lose its most effective hunter, especially when the alternatives seemed limited. There were few individuals with Ludwig's combination of skill, knowledge, and leadership ability, and replacing him would likely result in a significant weakening of the church's ability to respond to the growing threat. This tolerance for Ludwig's eccentricities would prove to be a serious mistake, but at the time it seemed like a reasonable accommodation for a valuable asset. The church had invested too much in Ludwig's leadership and innovations to abandon him over concerns that remained largely speculative, rather than based on clear evidence of incompetence or failure. But the corruption was advancing, steadily and inexorably, nurtured by the patient intelligence that resided within the Holy Moonlight Sword. Every day, Ludwig became less human and more something else, something that served purposes that had little to do with protecting humanity and everything to do with advancing cosmic agendas that operated on scales beyond mortal comprehension. Ludwig's deepest expeditions into the chalice dungeons eventually brought him into contact with knowledge that would fundamentally alter his understanding of reality and his place within it. In the deepest chambers of the labyrinths, in places where the labyrinth made contact with the cosmos itself, Ludwig encountered artifacts and inscriptions that revealed the true nature of the Great Ones and their relationship to humanity. These revelations were both terrifying and seductive, Ludwig learned that humanity was not the dominant species it believed itself to be, but rather something closer to an infant race, barely capable of comprehending the vast intelligences that governed the universe. The Great Ones were beings of such power and knowledge that their very existence warped reality around them, and their attention, whether benevolent or malevolent, could transform entire worlds. More disturbing still was the realization that the old blood itself was not simply a miraculous healing substance, but a form of communion with these cosmic entities. Each dose of blood ministration represented a step toward joining with intelligences that existed beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness. The beast scourge was not a corruption of the old blood's intended effects, but rather its natural conclusion, the transformation of human consciousness into something capable of existing on a cosmic scale. For most individuals, this knowledge would have been utterly devastating, enough to shatter their sanity and leave them gibbering in the depths of madness. But Ludwig's connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword provided him with a unique perspective on these cosmic truths. The weapon seemed to act as a filter, translating the incomprehensible into something that his human mind could process and utilize. Through the sword's guidance, Ludwig began to understand that the transformation into beasthood was not necessarily the catastrophic end that it appeared to be from a human perspective. It was a transitional state, a metamorphosis towards something that could operate on cosmic scales. With proper guidance and preparation, it might be possible to achieve this transformation while retaining enough individual consciousness to continue serving meaningful purposes. This revelation fundamentally altered Ludwig's approach to his work as a hunter. He was no longer simply fighting to destroy all beasts and protect humanity from transformation. He had begun to see himself as a guide who might help direct the inevitable evolution toward outcomes that preserved what was valuable in human consciousness, while embracing the power and perspective that transformation offered. These beliefs led Ludwig to intensify his experimental work, both on captured beasts and on himself. He began to see his own transformation not as a risk to be avoided, but as an opportunity to pioneer a path that others might follow. If he could successfully navigate the transformation process while maintaining his consciousness and purpose, he could serve as a model for how humanity might evolve without losing what made it human. The experiments Ludwig conducted during this period were both innovative and horrifying. He developed techniques for inducing controlled transformations in captured beasts, attempting to guide their evolution toward more stable and conscious forms. Most of these experiments ended in failure, with the subject either dying or devolving into even more savage and mindless forms. But occasionally, Ludwig would achieve results that suggested his theories had merit transformations that retained more intelligence and purpose than typical beast metamorphosis. The knowledge he gained from these experiments informed his own self-transformation efforts. Ludwig began introducing increasingly potent blood preparations into his system, carefully calibrated to induce specific changes while using the Holy Moonlight Sword's guidance to maintain psychological stability. He was, in effect, attempting to transform himself in a controlled and directed manner to cross the boundary between human and beast while retaining his essential self. The physical changes this produced were initially subtle, but gradually became more pronounced. Ludwig's musculature increased beyond normal human proportions. His bones began to lengthen and thicken. His senses sharpened to superhuman levels, allowing him to perceive things that ordinary humans could not. For a time, these enhancements made him even more effective as a hunter, capable of facing threats that would overwhelm any ordinary warrior. But the psychological changes were more troubling and ultimately more destructive. Ludwig's thought patterns were becoming increasingly alien, influenced by the cosmic perspective that the Holy Moonlight Sword provided. Human concerns and values began to seem trivial and meaningless when viewed from a cosmic scale. The suffering of individual hunters or civilians registered as acceptable losses in pursuit of greater understanding and evolution. His conversations with subordinates became more difficult and unsettling. Ludwig would reference concepts and principles that made no sense from a human perspective, speaking of cosmic imperatives and evolutionary necessities that had no basis in conventional morality or ethics. When questioned about decisions that seemed cruel or irrational, He would respond with explanations that drew on knowledge of cosmic forces that his questioners could not comprehend. The Holy Moonlight Sword's influence on Ludwig during this period became more overt and controlling. Witnesses reported seeing him having conversations with the weapon when he thought he was alone, treating it as if it were a sentient being capable of providing advice and guidance, which, of course, it was. The sword's description notes that it was Ludwig's true mentor, and it appeared that Ludwig had come to view it as more reliable and trustworthy than any human advisor. This relationship with the sword further isolated Ludwig from his former colleagues and allies. Other church officials found his behavior increasingly erratic and difficult to predict. Hunters who had once sought his guidance began to avoid him when possible, uncomfortable with the intensity of his gaze and the strange certainty with which he spoke about matters that seemed to have no rational basis. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult hunt in the lower levels of Yharnam, where Ludwig's forces encountered a pack of beasts that had been coordinating their attacks with disturbing intelligence, rather than employing the careful, systematic approach that had served him so well in the past. Ludwig ordered a direct frontal assault that resulted in heavy casualties among his hunters. When questioned about this decision by his surviving subordinates, Ludwig's response was so alien and incomprehensible that several hunters openly questioned his sanity. He spoke of cosmic imperatives and the necessity of blood sacrifice in terms that suggested he was no longer thinking primarily about protecting humanity, but rather about serving otherworldly purposes that he could not or would not explain. This incident marked the beginning of open resistance to Ludwig's leadership among the church hunters. Several senior hunters approached the church hierarchy with their concerns, providing detailed accounts of Ludwig's increasingly erratic behavior and requesting his removal from command. These reports were deeply troubling to church officials, but they also presented a difficult dilemma. The church's response was to implement a system of oversight designed to limit Ludwig's autonomy, while allowing him to continue in his role as the primary hunting coordinator. Senior church officials would now need to approve all major hunting operations, and Ludwig would be required to provide detailed explanations for his tactical decisions before they could be implemented. This system of oversight proved inadequate almost immediately. Ludwig had become adept at providing explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface, but were based on knowledge and assumptions that his overseers could not evaluate. His deep understanding of beast behavior and hunting tactics gave him significant credibility even when his decisions seemed questionable, and the urgent nature of the beast crisis made careful evaluation of his proposals difficult. More problematically, the oversight system failed to account for Ludwig's growing ability to operate independently of church authority. His connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword had given him access to knowledge and capabilities that made him less dependent on church resources and support. He could conduct independent hunting operations using techniques and equipment that the church hierarchy did not fully understand, making it difficult for them to monitor or control his activities. The final period of Ludwig's service as a church hunter was characterized by increasingly isolated and secretive operations. He would disappear for days or weeks at a time, returning with reports of successful hunts, but little detail about his methods or the specific threats he had encountered. These solo missions seemed to be successful, as evidenced by the reduction in beast activity in the areas where Ludwig had been operating, but they also represented a clear departure from the collaborative approach that had characterized his earlier leadership. During these solo expeditions, Ludwig ventured into the deepest and most dangerous areas of the chalice dungeons, seeking knowledge and artifacts that could advance his understanding of transformation and cosmic evolution. He encountered entities and forces that existed beyond the normal boundaries of reality, experiencing forms of communion with cosmic intelligences that no human mind was designed to withstand. These experiences provided Ludwig with profound insights into the nature of consciousness, reality, and the transformation process, but they also accelerated his corruption, eroding the last barriers between his human identity and the cosmic perspective that the Holy Moonlight Sword had been gradually instilling in him. Each expedition brought him closer to the point where he would no longer be recognizably human in any meaningful sense. The knowledge that Ludwig was gathering during these final expeditions was genuine and valuable from a cosmic perspective. He was learning things about the relationship between consciousness and physical form, about the mechanisms of transformation, about the true nature of the Great Ones and their plans for humanity. This knowledge could potentially have been used to guide humanity's evolution in directions that preserved what was valuable in human consciousness, while embracing cosmic perspective and power. But Ludwig had long since passed the point where he could make use of this knowledge in ways that served human interests. His priorities and values had been so thoroughly transformed by the Holy Moonlight Sword's influence that he no longer thought primarily in terms of protecting humanity or preserving human civilization. He had become an agent serving cosmic purposes that operated on scales that made individual human lives and human civilization itself seem momentary and inconsequential. The stage was set for Ludwig's final transformation, the culmination of a corruption process that had been advancing steadily since the moment he first grasped the Holy Moonlight Sword in the depths of the Chalice dungeons. The end of Ludwig's career as a hunter came not with a single dramatic event, but through a gradual process of deterioration that culminated in a transformation so complete that he was no longer recognizable as the man he had once been. The process began with his final expeditions into the deepest levels of the Chalice dungeons ventures that took him into chambers where the normal laws of reality no longer applied and where contact with cosmic intelligences became direct and unavoidable. These final expeditions were conducted in complete secrecy, without the knowledge or approval of the church hierarchy. Ludwig had become convinced that the solution to the beast scourge lay in the deepest chambers of the labyrinth, in artifacts and knowledge that predated human civilization. The Holy Moonlight Sword's guidance had become more insistent and specific, directing him toward particular locations and objectives that promised to unlock the ultimate secrets of transformation and power. What Ludwig discovered in those deepest chambers appears to have been knowledge that no human mind was designed to contain. The artifacts he encountered and the inscriptions he deciphered may have revealed truths about the Great Ones and their relationship to humanity. Based on what we can piece together from his transformation and the sword's influence, it seems the beast scourge may not have been merely a side effect of blood ministration, but perhaps something more deliberate, a process with cosmic implications that Ludwig came to understand. This revelation seems to have shattered the last vestiges of Ludwig's human perspective and moral framework. If we consider his dialogue and transformation, it appears that everything he had believed about his role as protector of humanity was called into question. The beasts he had spent his career hunting may have represented not simply enemies to be destroyed, but harbingers of a transformation that awaited all who partook deeply of the old blood. The choice may not have been between remaining human and becoming beast, but between understanding this process and being consumed by it blindly. Armed with this knowledge, or perhaps driven by it, Ludwig appears to have made a final, fatal decision. Rather than continuing to resist the transformation that exposure to the old blood had been gradually inducing, he may have chosen to embrace it, though whether this was truly a choice or an inevitable conclusion remains ambiguous. Unlike other church officials who succumbed to beasthood through excess and loss of control, Ludwig's transformation seems to have been influenced by his connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword, which may have provided some structure or guidance even in this terrible process. The transformation itself must have been agonizing beyond description. Ludwig's body changed in ways that defied biological logic, bones lengthening and reforming, muscles swelling to grotesque proportions, new structures emerging that had no parallel in normal mammalian anatomy. His form took on distinctly equine characteristics, a long face, four-legged stance, general body structure reminiscent of a massive, corrupted horse. But these were combined with predatory features, rows of jagged teeth, designed for tearing flesh, razor-sharp claws capable of rending stone and metal with equal ease. Most disturbingly, Ludwig's transformation produced not one, but multiple focal points of consciousness. His main head retained some semblance of his original features, though twisted and enlarged beyond recognition. But a secondary mouth appeared on his torso, lined with teeth and eyes. suggesting that his consciousness had become fractured. This secondary orifice would occasionally emit sounds that seemed almost like attempts at communication, as if some fragment of Ludwig's human consciousness was trying to speak through this additional aperture. The psychological changes that accompanied Ludwig's physical transformation appear to have been even more profound and disturbing. His consciousness seems to have been shattered into multiple aspects, with different parts of his mind operating independently and often in conflict with one another. The noble hunter who had dedicated his life to protecting humanity apparently still existed within the transformed creature, but it now coexisted with other impulses and drives that were fundamentally bestial in nature. This fractured consciousness made Ludwig's behavior as a beast unpredictable and terrifying. He would alternate between moments of almost human awareness and periods of pure bestial savagery. During his lucid moments, he seemed to express horror and regret at what he had become, appearing to recognize the magnitude of his fall. But these periods of clarity were brief and increasingly rare, quickly overwhelmed by the hunger and instinct that now dominated his mind. The Holy Moonlight Sword remained with Ludwig throughout his transformation, but its relationship to him had changed fundamentally. Rather than being a tool that he wielded, it appears to have become something more deeply integrated with his being, connected to his consciousness in ways that made separation impossible. The weapon's power continued to manifest through him, but whether it was still providing guidance or simply bound to him remains unclear. Ludwig's transformation marked the end of an era for the church hunters. Without his leadership and innovations, the organization quickly began to fragment and lose effectiveness. The specialized training and equipment that he had developed was so closely tied to his personal knowledge and insights that they proved difficult to transfer to other leaders. The hunters who had served under him found themselves adrift, lacking the guidance and confidence that his presence had provided. The church hierarchy's initial response to Ludwig's disappearance was one of denial and cover-up. They couldn't afford to admit that their most effective hunter had succumbed to the very corruption he had spent his career fighting against. Official accounts likely spoke of Ludwig's death in service to the church, with little mention of the true circumstances. But the truth proved difficult to conceal. Reports eventually began to circulate of a massive, intelligent beast that stalked the underground areas, a creature that seemed to possess knowledge and capabilities far beyond those of ordinary beasts. Hunters who encountered this creature and survived described it as something that had once been human, something that retained enough intelligence to make it far more dangerous than the mindless monsters they were accustomed to fighting. At some point, whether through death or through the mechanisms of the nightmare itself, Ludwig's consciousness was drawn into the hunter's nightmare, that otherworldly realm where blood-drunk hunters were condemned to continue their hunts for eternity. This realm served as both prison and perpetual torment for those who had lost themselves to the hunt, a place where the normal rules of death and regeneration were suspended. For Ludwig, the hunter's nightmare appears to have represented a profound irony. His greatest skills and achievements had become the source of his eternal torment. The very place where he had once been among humanity's greatest protectors had become the site of his endless, purposeless violence. The weapons and techniques he had developed to fight beasts were now turned against those who ventured into the nightmare, making him one of its most dangerous inhabitants. Ludwig's behavior in the nightmare was characterized by savage unpredictability. He would attack anything that entered his domain with mindless ferocity, using his massive size and supernatural strength to overwhelm opponents through brute force. His attacks were devastating, powerful charges that could crush bones, sweeping strikes that could send hunters flying, area of effect arcane blasts that could overwhelm multiple opponents simultaneously. Yet despite his bestial nature, Ludwig retained certain capabilities that suggested some persistence of intelligence beneath the surface. He could adapt his tactics when facing different types of opponents, learning from encounters and adjusting his approach. This adaptability made him far more dangerous than typical beasts, which relied primarily on instinct and aggression. Ludwig's connection to the arcane forces that had originally transformed him remained strong even in his degraded state. He could channel supernatural energies through his attacks, creating devastating assaults that seemed to bypass conventional defenses, striking directly at the life force of their targets. These arcane attacks were particularly dangerous because they could affect hunters even when physical defenses held. The most tragic aspect of Ludwig's existence as the beast was the occasional emergence of what seemed to be his human consciousness. During moments of extreme stress or when confronted with particular stimuli, fragments of Ludwig's original personality would appear to surface, with the beast expressing something that resembled horror and confusion at what he had become. These moments of apparent clarity were brief and rare, quickly giving way to bestial rage. Ludwig's physical form in the nightmare was a grotesque amalgamation that defied easy categorization. The equine characteristics were immediately striking: the elongated head, four-legged stance, and general body structure all evoked comparisons to a massive corrupted steed. But these horse-like features were combined with elements that were clearly predatory and unnatural. His mouth was filled with rows of jagged teeth, designed for tearing flesh, and his limbs ended in razor-sharp claws capable of rending through virtually any material. Multiple eyes dotted his form, giving him the ability to perceive threats from virtually any direction and contributing to his unsettling, alien appearance. The secondary mouth on his torso added another layer of horror, suggesting that Ludwig's consciousness had been fractured into competing aspects that literally inhabited different parts of his transformed body. The size alone was impressive and terrifying. Ludwig had become a creature of truly massive proportions, large enough to fill the underground chamber that served as his lair. His movements combined the power of his enormous mass with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. When Ludwig charged, the very ground would shake, and hunters had only moments to dodge or be crushed beneath his weight. His hide had thickened into something approaching armor, making him highly resistant to conventional weapons. Hunters found that attacks that would fell ordinary beasts barely seemed to affect Ludwig, forcing them to target specific weak points or use specialized techniques to inflict meaningful damage. This resilience made extended combat with Ludwig an exercise in endurance as much as skilled hunters had to maintain their focus and precision through lengthy battles where a single mistake could prove fatal. The presence of the Holy Moonlight Sword, even in its dormant state, continued to influence Ludwig's behavior and capabilities in the nightmare. The weapon remained embedded within his consciousness, occasionally manifesting as flashes of moonlight that accompanied his most devastating attacks. These manifestations suggested that the sword was still actively guiding Ludwig's actions, though toward purposes that were no longer comprehensible to outside observers. During his most lucid moments, Ludwig would seem to sense the sword's presence, turning his attention inward as if listening to voices that only he could hear. These episodes would sometimes precede shifts in his behavior, changes in tactics, alterations in aggression levels, sudden retreats or renewed attacks that seemed to follow patterns only the sword could perceive. The sword's influence also manifested in the arcane nature of many of Ludwig's attacks, the waves of shadowy energy that he could project, the way moonlight seemed to gather around his form during his most powerful assaults. These were not natural abilities of a beast transformation, but rather expressions of the cosmic power that the Holy Moonlight Sword channeled. Even in his fallen state, Ludwig remained connected to the abyssal cosmos that the sword represented. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of Ludwig's fate in the hunter's nightmare was the way it preserved just enough of his human consciousness to make him aware of what he had become while being powerless to change it. In his brief moments of clarity, Ludwig could remember his life as a hunter, his ideals and ambitions, the people he had sought to protect. The contrast between those memories and his current reality created a psychological torment that transcended physical suffering. These moments of awareness were also moments of profound guilt and remorse. Ludwig understood, during his lucid periods, that the corpses surrounding him represented hunters who had looked to him for leadership and protection. Many of them might have been his own students, trained according to his methods, inspired by his example. And he had killed them, torn them apart in fits of bestial rage that he could remember but not control. The nightmare realm seemed specifically designed to maximize this psychological suffering. It was not enough for Ludwig to simply be transformed into a beast. He had to remain conscious enough to understand what he had lost, to feel the weight of his failures, to experience the full horror of his corruption. The eternal hunt that defined his existence was both literal and metaphorical, a search for prey that could never satisfy his hunger, and a search for redemption that could never be achieved. The most dramatic and significant moment in Ludwig's existence within the hunter's nightmare came when he was finally confronted by a hunter capable of challenging his power and forcing him to access the deepest reserves of his original strength and skill. This confrontation served as a catalyst for the temporary restoration of Ludwig's human consciousness and his reunion with the Holy Moonlight Sword in its fully realized form. The battle that preceded this transformation was itself a testament to Ludwig's incredible resilience and power. Even in his degraded, bestial state, he proved capable of fighting on equal terms with some of the most skilled hunters ever to walk the blood-soaked streets of Yharnam. His combination of supernatural strength, arcane abilities, and residual tactical knowledge made him a formidable opponent whose defeat required not just skill and courage, but also an understanding of the cosmic forces that had shaped his transformation. The hunter who faced Ludwig in his beast form had to contend with a creature that combined the worst aspects of both physical and supernatural threats. Ludwig's charges were devastating, capable of crushing bones and armor with equal ease. His sweeping attacks could clear entire areas, forcing the hunter to time their dodges with split-second precision, and his arcane blasts waves of cosmic energy that erupted from his form required the hunter to read subtle tells and react before the attacks fully manifested. But the most challenging aspect of fighting Ludwig was his unpredictability. The fractured nature of his consciousness meant that his behavior could shift rapidly and without warning. Moments of bestial rage would give way to periods of almost strategic calculation, as if different aspects of his mind were taking turns controlling his actions. A hunter who adapted to one pattern would suddenly find Ludwig fighting in an entirely different manner, requiring constant vigilance and adaptation. The underground corpse pile that served as the battlefield added another layer of challenge. The uneven footing created by the bodies, the rivers of blood that made movement treacherous, the oppressive atmosphere of death and decay, all of this worked to Ludwig's advantage. He was adapted to this environment, having made it his lair for what seemed like an eternity. Hunters entering his domain were at an immediate disadvantage, fighting on terrain that favored the massive beast over human-sized opponents. As the battle reached its climax, and Ludwig found himself pushed to the very limits of his endurance, something remarkable occurred. The Holy Moonlight Sword, which had remained dormant within his consciousness throughout his time in the nightmare, suddenly awakened to its full power. The weapon manifested in physical form, its blade glowing with the pale ethereal light that had once guided Ludwig through his darkest moments as a human hunter. The sword's awakening triggered a cascade of changes in Ludwig's form and consciousness. His beast-style appearance began to shift and reorganize, taking on a more humanoid configuration that retained elements of his beast transformation while incorporating new aspects that seemed to draw from mythological sources. The result was a form that evoked comparison to a centaur, a creature that was part human and part horse, but elevated to cosmic proportions. More importantly, the sword's presence restored much of Ludwig's original personality and intelligence. The scattered fragments of his consciousness were reunited, allowing him to think and speak coherently for the first time since his transformation. The return of human awareness brought with it a flood of memories and emotions that had been suppressed during his time as a mindless beast. Ludwig's first words upon regaining his consciousness were directed toward the Holy Moonlight Sword itself. "Ah, you were at my side all along. My true mentor. My guiding moonlight." These words revealed the depth of his relationship with the weapon and his understanding of the role it had played in both his rise and his fall. The sword was not simply a tool or even a source of power. It was his constant companion, the one entity that had remained with him through every stage of his transformation. The reunion with the sword brought with it a restoration of Ludwig's fighting abilities, but in a form that transcended anything he had achieved as a human hunter. His movements became fluid and precise, combining the raw power of his transformed state with the tactical sophistication that had made him legendary. He wielded the Holy Moonlight Sword with grace and devastating effectiveness. the blade leaving trails of ethereal light in the air as it swept through complex attack patterns. The sword itself seemed to channel cosmic forces in ways that defied conventional understanding of physics and reality. When Ludwig swung the blade, it would release waves of energy that traveled across the battlefield, forcing his opponent to dodge not just the physical strike, but the projectile attacks that followed. The moonlight that emanated from the sword wasn't merely illumination. It was a manifestation of power from the abyssal cosmos, capable of cutting through dimensions as easily as it cut through flesh. This transformation represented more than just a temporary restoration of Ludwig's human consciousness. It was a revelation of what he might have become if his original transformation had been guided more skillfully. The combination of human intelligence, bestial power, and cosmic insight created a being that was arguably superior to any purely human hunter, regardless of their skill or equipment. Ludwig's attacks in this elevated state showcased combat on a scale that had rarely been witnessed in Yharnam. He combined swordplay with arcane manipulation and raw physical force, creating a spectacle of deadly beauty. His thrusts with the Holy Moonlight Sword could impale opponents and then channel cosmic energy through their bodies. His overhead slashes would release cascading waves of moonlight that carved furrows in the stone floor. His sweeping attacks could clear entire areas while leaving trails of energy that persisted for seconds afterward. Yet even in this elevated state, Ludwig remained fundamentally changed by his experiences. His perspective had been altered by his contact with cosmic forces and his time in the Hunter's Nightmare in ways that made it impossible for him to simply return to his former role as protector of humanity. He had seen too much, understood too much, and lost too much to ever again be the inspirational leader he had once been. The tragic irony of Ludwig's restoration was that it came too late to undo the damage that had been done. His transformation had already claimed countless lives and contributed to the breakdown of the church hunting system that he had worked so hard to create. The return of his consciousness allowed him to appreciate the full scope of this damage, but not to repair it. The battle that followed Ludwig's transformation was, in many ways, a battle between past and future, between what Ludwig had been and what he had become, between human values and cosmic imperatives, between the ideal of the honorable hunter and the reality of corruption and transformation. Each clash of weapons represented not just a physical contest, but a philosophical one, a question about whether redemption was possible for those who had fallen as far as Ludwig had. The knowledge that Ludwig possessed in this state was both blessing and curse. He understood the mechanisms of his transformation, the role of the Holy Moonlight Sword in his corruption, the cosmic purposes that his suffering had served. But this understanding came without the power to change what had already occurred. He was like a man who suddenly remembers a nightmare with perfect clarity, able to see every detail of the horror, but unable to wake from it or prevent its continuation. Following his defeat in combat, Ludwig found himself in a state of profound exhaustion and clarity that allowed for perhaps the most honest and revealing conversation of his entire existence. Lying in a pool of his own blood, with his consciousness finally restored to something approaching its original state, Ludwig was capable of reflecting on his life, his choices, and the consequences of his actions with a perspective that had been impossible during his years of gradual corruption. The nature of this final dialogue depended largely on the approach taken by those who had defeated him. For hunters who appeared before him wearing the garb of the healing church, the organization he had served, and ultimately betrayed Ludwig's concerns, focused on the legacy he had left behind, and the fate of the institution he had helped to build. "Good hunter of the church," Ludwig would say, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of accumulated guilt and regret. "Have you seen the thread of light? Just a hair, a fleeting thing, yet I clung to it, steeped as I was in the stench of blood and beasts. I never wanted to know what it really was. Really, I didn't. I didn't." These words revealed the fundamental tragedy of Ludwig's story. The thread of light that had guided him throughout his career, the visions provided by the Holy Moonlight Sword, the dancing sprites that had emptied his fears during the hunt had ultimately been the source of his corruption. He had clung to this guidance because it provided comfort and confidence in a world of increasing horror. But he had willfully ignored the cost of this dependence, choosing not to examine too closely the true nature of the forces that were helping him. This admission of willful ignorance was perhaps Ludwig's most human moment in the entire conversation. It revealed that his corruption was not the result of simple deception, but of a choice to accept help without questioning its source, to embrace power without considering its price, to follow guidance without examining where it might lead. Ludwig had known, at some level, that the Holy Moonlight Sword represented something dangerous and alien, but he had chosen not to confront that knowledge because doing so might have required him to give up the comfort and strength the sword provided. When questioned about the current state of the church hunters, the warriors he had trained, the system he had built, Ludwig's response revealed his deepest hopes and fears about his legacy. Are my church hunters the honorable Spartans I hoped they would be? The question carried with it the weight of a man who had dedicated his life to building something noble and righteous, only to discover that his own corruption had potentially undermined everything he had worked to achieve. If assured that the church hunters had maintained their honor and continued to serve humanity's interests with the ideals he had instilled in them, Ludwig would express profound relief. "Ah, good," he would say, his voice softening with what might have been a smile, had his transformed features been capable of such an expression. "That is a relief to know. I did not suffer such denigration for nothing. Thank you kindly. Now I may sleep in peace. Even in this darkest of nights I see the moonlight." Over this seldis. The moonlight. The moonlight. Over I says here, over US. Likest, I said this. These final words suggested that Ludwig's greatest fear was not death or eternal torment, but the possibility that his life's work had been meaningless. The knowledge that the church hunters continued to embody the ideals he had tried to instill in them provided him with the peace necessary to finally let go of his tortured existence. Even after everything he had become, even after all the suffering he had caused and endured, Ludwig's deepest concern remained for the institution he had built and the people he had trained to protect humanity. But if informed that the church hunters had failed to maintain their standards, that they had become corrupted, abandoned their mission, or fallen to the same bloodlust that had claimed so many others, Ludwig's response revealed the depth of his despair. "Oh my," he would say, his voice hollow with resignation. "Just as I feared. Then a beast-possessed degenerate was I. As my detractors made eminently clear, does the nightmare never end?" This alternative response highlighted Ludwig's awareness of the criticism he had faced during his later years as a hunter. His detractors had accused him of being a beast-possessed degenerate long before his actual transformation, suggesting that his corruption had been visible to others even when he himself was unwilling to acknowledge it. The confirmation that his fears about his legacy were justified would condemn him to continue his tormented existence, unable to find peace even in death. For hunters who approached Ludwig without wearing church garb, his dialogue took a different direction, focusing more on the nature of his transformation and the cosmic forces that had shaped his fate. In these conversations, Ludwig would speak more directly about the thread of light that had guided him and his unwillingness to confront the true nature of the forces he had been serving. "Have you seen the thread of light?" he would ask, his voice tinged with a desperate hope that perhaps the hunter before him might understand what he had experienced. "Just a hair, a fleeting thing, yet I clung to it, steeped as I was in the stench of blood and beasts." The thread of light represented the Holy Moonlight Sword's guidance. Those visions of dancing sprites that had provided him with comfort and direction during his darkest moments. But Ludwig's admission that he never wanted to know what it really was revealed the core of his tragedy. He had chosen ignorance, had actively avoided examining the true nature of the forces that were helping him. This willful blindness wasn't born of stupidity or weakness, but of fear that understanding the truth might require him to give up the support and power that made his work possible. These conversations revealed Ludwig's understanding that his transformation had not been entirely involuntary. At some level, he had chosen to follow the guidance provided by the Holy Moonlight Sword, even when that guidance led him away from his human values and moral compass. His unwillingness to question the source of his power had been a form of deliberate ignorance that enabled his corruption. The tragedy of these final conversations was Ludwig's clear awareness of what he had lost and what he had become. His consciousness had been restored enough to allow him to appreciate the scope of his fall, but not enough to undo the damage that had been done. He could see his mistakes clearly, but could not travel back in time to avoid making them. The question of whether Ludwig achieved some form of redemption through these final conversations remained deliberately ambiguous. His expression of remorse and his concern for his legacy suggested genuine repentance. The fact that he could still care about the fate of the church hunters, could still hope that his work had served some positive purpose, indicated that the noble impulses that had originally driven him to take up the hunt had not been entirely destroyed by his transformation. But the cosmic scope of his crimes, the lives lost due to his corruption, the damage done to the church hunting system, the suffering he had caused during his time in the hunter's nightmare, made traditional notions of forgiveness and redemption difficult to apply. Perhaps the most that could be said was that Ludwig achieved a form of understanding about his life and choices that provided him with the clarity necessary to finally find peace. The presence of the Holy Moonlight Sword during these final conversations added another layer of complexity to Ludwig's situation. The weapon remained with him, even in defeat, suggesting that their bond transcended the boundaries of life and death. Whether this represented continued corruption or some form of redemption was unclear, but it indicated that Ludwig's relationship with the cosmic forces that had shaped his transformation was not easily severed. After Ludwig's death, the Holy Moonlight Sword would be claimed by those who had defeated him, passing from one wielder to another as the cycles of corruption and redemption continued. The weapon remained as both tool and trap, offering genuine power and knowledge to those brave enough to seek it, while gradually corrupting them according to cosmic purposes they would never fully understand. Simon the Harrowed, the hunter who had investigated Ludwig's story and pursued him into the hunter's nightmare, understood the sword's true nature better than most. When he eventually came into possession of the weapon or directed others toward it, he did so with full awareness of the dangers it represented. His description of the Holy Moonlight Sword as the blinding thread that led and misled that consummate hero captured the essential paradox of Ludwig's story, that the same guidance which had made him great had also destroyed him. For hunters who claimed the Holy Moonlight Sword after Ludwig's final defeat, the weapon represented both an incredible opportunity and a terrible danger. Its power was undeniable, the ability to channel the abyssal cosmos, to strike with waves of moonlight, to access knowledge and capabilities far beyond those of normal hunters. But that power came with the same risks that had ultimately consumed Ludwig, the same subtle corruption, the same gradual erosion of human values and perspectives. The sword's continued existence ensured that Ludwig's story would be repeated in different forms with different individuals. Each new wielder would face the same choices and temptations that had ultimately claimed their predecessor. Some might learn from Ludwig's example and find ways to resist or transcend the corruption. Others would inevitably share his fate, becoming new cautionary tales in the ongoing saga of humanity's encounter with cosmic forces beyond its comprehension. Among the various figures who witnessed Ludwig's transformation and its aftermath, none was more dedicated to understanding and exposing the truth than Simon the Harrowed, a hunter whose own tragic story intertwined with Ludwig's in ways that revealed the broader scope of the corruption that had consumed the healing church's hunting operations. Simon had been one of Ludwig's hunters during the height of the church's power, serving with distinction in some of the most dangerous expeditions into beast-infested areas of Yharnam. He had witnessed firsthand the gradual changes in Ludwig's behavior and priorities, watching with growing alarm as his respected leader became something alien and incomprehensible. The investigator, unlike many of his colleagues, Simon had not been willing to rationalize or ignore these changes. He recognized them as symptoms of a corruption that threatened the very foundations of the hunting enterprise. When Ludwig's final transformation occurred, Simon was among the few hunters who understood the true scope of what had happened. Rather than accepting the church's official explanation of Ludwig's heroic death in service to humanity, Simon began his own investigation into the circumstances that had led to his leader's fall. This investigation would ultimately lead him into the hunter's nightmare, where he would witness the true extent of Ludwig's degradation and the cosmic forces that had shaped his fate. Simon's pursuit of the truth about Ludwig was motivated by more than simple curiosity or desire for justice. He understood that Ludwig's corruption was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern that threatened all hunters who worked closely with the old blood and its associated artifacts. By understanding how Ludwig had fallen, Simon hoped to prevent similar fates from befalling other hunters, or perhaps even to find a way to reverse the damage that had already been done. The investigation that Simon conducted was dangerous and largely solitary work. The church hierarchy had no interest in having the truth about Ludwig's transformation revealed, as it would undermine their authority and credibility with both hunters and the general population. Simon found himself increasingly isolated from his former colleagues, many of whom viewed his persistence in pursuing unwelcome truths as a form of disloyalty or madness. Simon's research into Ludwig's story eventually led him to discover the existence of the hunter's nightmare and the fate that awaited those hunters who became too deeply corrupted by their work. This knowledge was both illuminating and terrifying, providing answers to questions about Ludwig's transformation, while raising new concerns about the ultimate destination of all who followed the hunter's path. The decision to enter the hunter's nightmare in pursuit of Ludwig was perhaps the most significant choice of Simon's career. He understood that doing so would likely condemn him to the same fate that had claimed his former leader, but he also recognized that it might be the only way to gain the knowledge necessary to help other hunters avoid similar corruption. Within the hunter's nightmare, Simon witnessed the full horror of what Ludwig had become. The noble leader who had once inspired entire communities to take up arms against the beast scourge had been reduced to a mindless creature driven by insatiable hunger for blood and violence. The sight of Ludwig's degraded state provided Simon with confirmation of his worst fears about the ultimate cost of the hunter's path. But Simon's presence in the hunter's nightmare also provided him with opportunities to observe Ludwig's brief moments of restored consciousness and to understand the cosmic forces that continued to influence his behavior. These observations gave Simon insights into the nature of the corruption that threatened all hunters and the role that artifacts like the Holy Moonlight Sword played in facilitating that corruption. Simon's confrontation with Ludwig during the beast's final moments provided both hunters with a form of closure that had been denied to them during their mortal lives. For Ludwig, Simon's presence represented a connection to his former life and values that helped him achieve the clarity necessary to face his fate with dignity. For Simon, the encounter provided confirmation that even the most corrupted hunters retained some spark of their original humanity that could be reached under the right circumstances. The aftermath of Ludwig's final defeat left Simon in possession of critical knowledge about the Holy Moonlight Sword and the dangers it represented. Unlike Ludwig, Simon recognized the weapon for what it truly was: a conduit for cosmic forces that were fundamentally alien to human values and purposes. His understanding of the sword's true nature informed how he dealt with the weapon after Ludwig's death. Simon's description of the Holy Moonlight Sword as the blinding thread that led and misled that consummate hero became one of the most poignant epitaphs for Ludwig's life and career. It captured the essential paradox of his story, that the same cosmic guidance which had made him so effective as a hunter had ultimately led to his downfall, creating a situation where success and failure became indistinguishable from one another. The knowledge that Simon gained from his investigation into Ludwig's story and his experience in the hunter's nightmare would eventually inform his broader understanding of the corruption that threatened all who worked with the old blood. His insights into the cosmic forces that shaped the hunter's path provided valuable warnings for those who might still be saved from similar fates. Simon understood that the problem was not simply individual weakness or moral failing, but a systematic corruption built into the very tools and techniques that made hunting possible. The weapons infused with old blood, the blood ministrations that enhanced hunter capabilities, the arcane artifacts discovered in the chalice dungeons, all of these carried with them subtle influences that gradually eroded human values and prepared hunters for eventual transformation. His warnings, delivered to those who would listen, emphasized the importance of maintaining awareness of these corrupting influences. Hunters needed to be conscious of the psychological changes they were experiencing, to question the sources of their power, to maintain connections to human relationships and values that could anchor them against cosmic perspectives that made individual human lives seem meaningless. But Simon also understood that his warnings would likely go unheeded by many. The pressures of the hunt, the desperate need for power to face escalating threats, the seductive comfort provided by artifacts like the Holy Moonlight Sword, all of these created conditions where hunters would choose to ignore dangers they could not fully confront. Ludwig's story would be repeated, in different forms and with different individuals, as long as the beast scourge continued and hunters sought power from questionable sources. Simon's own fate, condemned to the hunter's nightmare through his investigations, represented another tragic irony. In seeking to understand and prevent the corruption that had claimed Ludwig, he had exposed himself to the same forces and suffered a similar doom. But his sacrifice was not without meaning. The knowledge he gathered and the warnings he provided offered at least the possibility that some future hunters might avoid the paths that had led to such tragedy. The Healing Church workshop that Ludwig had built and led represented perhaps the most ambitious attempt in Yharnam's history to create a systematic, organized response to the beast scourge. Under his leadership, the workshop had evolved from a simple weapons manufacturing facility into a comprehensive training center, research institute, and command headquarters that coordinated hunting operations throughout the church's territory. The workshop's design and organization reflected Ludwig's understanding of the evolving nature of the threat that Yharnam faced. Unlike Gehrman's workshop, which had been designed to support a small number of highly skilled hunters, Ludwig's facility was built for scalability and mass production. The massive circular tower that housed the workshop could accommodate hundreds of hunters in training, dozens of weaponsmiths and artificers, and extensive research facilities dedicated to understanding the nature of beasts and the forces that created them. The weapons that emerged from Ludwig's workshop represented a fundamental shift in hunting philosophy and technology. Where Gehrman's weapons had emphasized precision, elegance, and the individual skill of their wielders, Ludwig's designs prioritized reliability, power, and ease of use. The Kirkhammer, Ludwig's holy blade, and other church weapons were designed to be effective in the hands of relatively inexperienced hunters, while still offering advanced capabilities for those who mastered their use. This approach to weapon design had profound implications for the democratization of the hunt. By creating weapons that could be used effectively by ordinary citizens after minimal training, Ludwig had made it possible for entire communities to participate in their own defense against the beast threat. This transformation of hunting from the work of elite specialists to a mass movement represented one of Ludwig's most significant achievements as a leader. The training programs that Ludwig developed were equally innovative, combining physical conditioning, weapons instruction, and moral education in ways that produced hunters who were not only effective in combat, but also capable of inspiring confidence and loyalty in the civilian population. The emphasis on honor and righteousness that characterized Ludwig's approach to hunter training was designed to provide psychological resistance to the corruption that threatened all who worked closely with the old blood. The workshop's research facilities were perhaps its most ambitious component, dedicated to understanding the fundamental nature of the beast scourge and developing more effective countermeasures. Under Ludwig's direction, teams of scholar hunters conducted extensive studies of beast behavior, physiology, and the transformation process itself. This research produced valuable insights that informed both weapon design and tactical doctrine. But the workshop's research activities also exposed its personnel to knowledge and influences that proved to be deeply corrupting. The study of beast transformation required extensive contact with corrupted blood samples, tainted artifacts, and otherworldly forces that gradually eroded the sanity and humanity of those involved. Many of the workshop's most promising researchers eventually succumbed to the very corruption they had been attempting to understand. Ludwig's own transformation had devastating effects on the workshop's organization and effectiveness. His increasingly erratic behavior and priorities undermined the morale and confidence of the hunters under his command, while his secretive research activities diverted resources away from practical hunting operations. The esprit de corps that had been one of the workshop's greatest strengths began to erode as hunters lost faith in their leader's judgment and motives. The final period of Ludwig's leadership was characterized by a series of increasingly dangerous and poorly planned hunting operations that resulted in heavy casualties among the workshop's personnel. These losses were not just numerical setbacks, but fundamental blows to the organization's institutional knowledge and experience. The deaths of veteran hunters and researchers represented the loss of years of accumulated expertise that could not be easily replaced. When Ludwig's transformation finally occurred, the workshop was left without effective leadership or clear direction. The specialized knowledge and techniques that he had developed were too closely tied to his personal insights and innovations to be easily transferred to other leaders. The hunters who remained found themselves adrift, lacking the guidance and confidence that Ludwig's presence had provided. The church hierarchy's response to the workshop's crisis was inadequate and poorly coordinated. The officials who attempted to assume control of hunting operations lacked the practical experience and technical knowledge necessary to maintain the sophisticated systems that Ludwig had developed. Their attempts to impose traditional bureaucratic management on the workshop's operations only accelerated its decline. The weapons production that had been one of the workshop's great strengths began to suffer as skilled craftsmen and artificers were lost to beast attacks or corruption. The standardized designs that had made mass production possible became a liability when the knowledge necessary to maintain quality control was lost. Weapons of inconsistent quality and reliability began to emerge from the workshop, undermining hunter confidence and effectiveness. The training programs that had been so successful under Ludwig's leadership became increasingly ineffective as the moral and philosophical framework that had supported them collapsed. Without the inspirational leadership that Ludwig had provided, new recruits struggled to develop the psychological resilience necessary to resist corruption. The honorable Spartans that Ludwig had envisioned gave way to hunters who were motivated primarily by fear and desperation. The research activities that had once been the workshop's most promising aspect became its greatest liability. Without Ludwig's guidance and the cosmic insights provided by the Holy Moonlight Sword, researchers found themselves overwhelmed by the knowledge they were attempting to understand. Many succumbed to madness or corruption, while others abandoned their work out of fear of similar fates. The decline of the workshop had cascading effects throughout the healing church's operations. Hunting missions became less coordinated and effective, allowing the beast scourge to spread into areas that had previously been secure. The loss of institutional knowledge and expertise made it increasingly difficult to develop responses to new types of threats or evolving beast behaviors. The civilian population, which had once looked to the church hunters as symbols of hope and protection, began to lose confidence in their ability to maintain order and security. This erosion of public trust undermined the social cohesion that had been one of Ludwig's greatest achievements, leading to the breakdown of the community-based resistance to the beast threat that he had worked so hard to build. The workshop's physical infrastructure, that massive circular tower that had once buzzed with purposeful activity, became a monument to failure rather than achievement. The halls that had once echoed with the sounds of training and manufacture grew silent as personnel fled or transformed. The forges grew cold as the craftsmen who had operated them were lost. The armories that had once been filled with weapons awaiting distribution stood empty or filled with rusting, neglected equipment. In time, the workshop would become little more than a haunted shell, a reminder of what had been achieved and what had been lost. Hunters passing through its abandoned halls could still see evidence of Ludwig's innovations, the standardized weapon components, the training equipment he had designed, the organizational charts that showed the sophisticated command structure he had created. But these remnants only emphasized the magnitude of the collapse that had occurred. The workshop's legacy extended beyond its physical decline, however. The weapons and techniques that Ludwig had developed continued to be used by hunters throughout Yharnam, carrying with them both the benefits of his innovations and the risks of the cosmic influences he had unwittingly introduced. Future generations of hunters would wield Kirkhammers and Ludwig's holy blades, often without understanding the full history of these weapons or the fate of the man who had designed them. Ludwig's transformation and ultimate fate represented far more than the personal tragedy of a single hunter. however significant his individual contributions might have been. His story served as a microcosm of the broader cosmic drama that was unfolding in Yharnam and throughout the world as humanity encountered forces that exceeded its capacity for understanding or control. The old blood that had made the healing church possible was itself a manifestation of cosmic intelligence, a form of communication or influence from beings that existed on scales of space and time that dwarfed human comprehension. The beast scourge was not an accidental side effect of blood ministration, but a deliberate process of transformation designed to prepare humanity for integration into a cosmic order that operated according to principles completely alien to human values and understanding. Ludwig's role in this cosmic drama was that of an unwitting agent, a figure whose exceptional capabilities and moral commitment made him an ideal candidate for manipulation by forces that understood human psychology far better than humans understood cosmic purposes. His gradual corruption followed patterns that had been repeated countless times throughout the universe, as other species encountered similar transformative influences. The Holy Moonlight Sword that became Ludwig's constant companion was one of many artifacts through which cosmic intelligences interacted with material reality. These objects served as conduits for influence and communication, allowing beings that existed primarily in abstract realms to affect physical events and guide the development of less advanced species. The sword's relationship with Ludwig represented a successful example of this type of cosmic intervention. The knowledge that Ludwig gained through his connection to the sword was genuine and valuable, but it was also carefully selected and presented to advance cosmic objectives rather than human interests. The tactical insights and enhanced capabilities that made Ludwig such an effective hunter were side effects of a process designed to transform him into something that could serve purposes he was never allowed to fully understand. The beast transformations that Ludwig spent his career fighting were trial runs for the same process that ultimately claimed him. Each beast represented an experiment in cosmic transformation, an attempt to convert human consciousness into something more compatible with otherworldly intelligence. Most of these experiments failed, producing creatures that retained neither their original humanity nor effective cosmic consciousness. But each failure provided valuable data for refining the transformation process. Ludwig's transformation was notable because it achieved a higher degree of success than typical beast metamorphosis. His connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword provided guidance and stability that allowed him to retain more of his original capabilities while incorporating cosmic elements that made him far more powerful than any purely human hunter. In effect, he became a prototype for the kind of hybrid consciousness that the cosmic intelligences were attempting to create. The hunter's nightmare that became Ludwig's prison was itself a cosmic artifact, a realm designed to contain and study the results of various transformation experiments. The nightmare served multiple purposes. It prevented failed transformations from interfering with ongoing experiments. It provided a controlled environment for observing the long-term effects of cosmic influence, and it offered opportunities for further refinement of transformation techniques. Ludwig's eventual defeat and the recovery of his consciousness represented a temporary setback for the cosmic forces that had shaped his transformation, but not a fundamental victory for humanity. The knowledge and capabilities that he had developed under cosmic influence remained embedded in the weapons, techniques, and institutional structures of the healing church. Even in death, Ludwig continued to serve cosmic purposes through the legacy he had created. The Holy Moonlight Sword's continued existence, after Ludwig's defeat, ensured that the cosmic intelligence that had guided his transformation would have opportunities to influence future hunters and leaders. The weapon's power and the knowledge it represented would continue to attract individuals seeking the capabilities necessary to deal with the beast scourge, creating opportunities for the transformation process to begin anew with different subjects. The broader implications of Ludwig's story extended beyond Yharnam to encompass the entire cosmic order of which humanity was a small and relatively insignificant part. The transformation processes that had claimed Ludwig and created the beast scourge were being implemented simultaneously on countless worlds throughout the universe, representing a vast project of cosmic evolution that operated on scales of time and space that made individual human lives appear momentary and inconsequential. Yet the tragedy of Ludwig's fall was not diminished by this cosmic perspective. If anything, the knowledge that his corruption served purposes he never understood made his fate more poignant rather than less significant. The noble ideals and genuine accomplishments that had characterized his career as a hunter represented authentic human values that retained their meaning, even when they were ultimately overwhelmed by forces beyond human comprehension or control. The lesson of Ludwig's story was not that resistance to cosmic influence was futile, but that such resistance required a deeper understanding of the forces involved and a more sophisticated approach to the choices that determined individual and collective fate. The cosmic intelligences that had corrupted Ludwig were not omnipotent or infallible. They could be understood, predicted, and potentially even opposed by those who developed sufficient knowledge and wisdom. But gaining such understanding without being corrupted by it presented a challenge that few humans could meet. The very process of learning about cosmic forces tended to expose individuals to their influence, creating a situation where knowledge itself became a vector for corruption. Ludwig's fall demonstrated this paradox. His pursuit of understanding and power to better protect humanity had been precisely the path that led to his destruction. The consequences of Ludwig's transformation and the collapse of his workshop extended far beyond the immediate effects on the healing church's hunting operations. The institutional knowledge, training methods, and weapons technology that he had developed continued to influence events in Yharnam long after his personal downfall, creating ripple effects that shaped the city's ultimate fate. The weapons that emerged from Ludwig's workshop became standard equipment for hunters throughout Yharnam and beyond, carrying with them the philosophical and tactical approaches that he had developed. The emphasis on aggressive combat and rally mechanics that characterized these weapons continued to influence hunter behavior, creating psychological patterns that made future generations more susceptible to the same corruption that had claimed their creator. The Kirkhammer and Ludwig's holy blade became symbols of the church's power and authority, visible reminders of the period when organized hunting had seemed to offer hope for controlling the beast scourge. But these weapons also carried subtle influences that their wielders rarely recognized, design elements and enchantments that gradually wore down their users' resistance to cosmic influence, preparing them for eventual transformation. The training methods that Ludwig had developed were adopted and modified by other hunting organizations, spreading his approaches to combat and hunter development throughout the region. These methods emphasized aggression, persistence, and reliance on rally mechanics in ways that initially seemed beneficial, but ultimately created psychological vulnerabilities that cosmic forces could exploit. The mass production techniques that had made the church workshop so effective were copied by other weapons manufacturers, leading to the widespread availability of hunting equipment that retained traces of cosmic influence. Even hunters who had no direct connection to the healing church found themselves using weapons and techniques that had been shaped by Ludwig's innovations and the cosmic intelligence that had guided them. The institutional structures that Ludwig had created within the healing church provided templates for other organizations attempting to deal with the beast scourge. The combination of military organization, religious authority, and technological innovation that characterized his approach was imitated by groups throughout the region, spreading both the benefits and the dangers of his methods. The research traditions that Ludwig had established continued to attract scholars and hunters seeking to understand the fundamental nature of the beast scourge. These investigations often led to the discovery of cosmic artifacts and knowledge that created new opportunities for corruption and transformation. The very success of Ludwig's research methods ensured that future generations would continue to encounter the same dangerous influences that had ultimately claimed him. The social and political changes that Ludwig's innovations had created within Yharnam society persisted long after his disappearance. The democratization of hunting that he had achieved through his training programs and weapon designs had created a culture in which civilian participation in violent conflict was normalized and expected. This cultural shift made the population more accepting of increasingly extreme measures to deal with the beast threat. The psychological impact of Ludwig's fall on the hunting community was profound and lasting. The knowledge that even the greatest and most noble of hunters could succumb to corruption created a sense of fatalism and despair that undermined morale and effectiveness. Future hunters struggled with the knowledge that their own efforts might ultimately serve the very forces they were attempting to combat. The church hierarchy's attempts to cover up the true circumstances of Ludwig's transformation created institutional patterns of secrecy and denial that hampered effective responses to similar threats. The unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the cosmic forces that influenced their work left future church leaders unprepared for the challenges they would face. The Holy Moonlight Sword's continued existence and its eventual transfer to other hunters ensured that Ludwig's story would be repeated in different forms with different individuals. The weapon's power continued to attract those seeking the capabilities necessary to deal with increasingly dangerous threats, creating new opportunities for cosmic forces to identify and corrupt potential agents. The legend of Ludwig the Holy Blade that developed in the years following his transformation became a complex mixture of truth and mythology that served multiple purposes. For some, it represented an inspirational example of what dedicated hunters could achieve. For others, it served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking power from questionable sources. Efter fel för våsikavedidika. For both feels specivials. For feel rose well wills. The cosmic intelligences that had shaped Ludwig's fate found both interpretations useful for their ongoing projects. The specific techniques and innovations that Ludwig had developed for hunting the largest and most dangerous beasts remained relevant as the beast scourge continued to evolve and intensify. Future hunters found themselves forced to adopt increasingly extreme measures to deal with threats that seemed to grow more powerful and intelligent with each generation, often without realizing that they were following paths that had already led to corruption and downfall. The architectural and institutional legacy of Ludwig's workshop provided physical foundations for future hunting organizations and research facilities. The circular tower that had housed his operations continued to serve as a center for hunter training and weapon production, carrying with it subtle influences and embedded knowledge that shaped the work of future generations. Ludwig's fate within the hunter's nightmare represented his incorporation into cosmic cycles that operated on scales far beyond individual human experience. His eternal hunt in the underground corpse pile was not simply a punishment for his corruption, but a functional component of larger processes that served purposes he was never allowed to fully understand. The hunter's nightmare itself was a cosmic artifact designed to contain and utilize the results of various transformation experiments. The endless cycles of violence and suffering that characterized existence within the nightmare were not arbitrary torments, but carefully structured processes that served multiple cosmic objectives. The damned hunters who inhabited the nightmare provided valuable data about the long-term effects of different types of corruption and transformation. Ludwig's position within this cosmic machinery was both privileged and tragic. His connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword and the cosmic intelligence that inhabited it made him a more valuable subject for study and observation than typical nightmare inhabitants. The intelligence that had guided his transformation continued to monitor his behavior and development within the nightmare environment, using his experiences to refine future transformation techniques. The endless hunt that defined Ludwig's existence in the nightmare served as a form of cosmic research into the nature of consciousness and identity under extreme conditions. Sus the fornja woloi sever selman fosto woe expose, an identity under extreme conditions, his ability to retain fragments of his original personality and values despite his transformation provided valuable insights into the persistence of human elements within hybrid consciousness. These insights informed ongoing efforts to create more stable and effective combinations of human and cosmic awareness. The blood that flowed from Ludwig's lair through the hunter's nightmare was not simply the result of his violent activities, but a form of cosmic communication that carried information about his experiences and development to intelligences that existed outside the nightmare itself. Each drop of blood contained encoded data about the effects of transformation and the potential for further evolution. The periodic restoration of Ludwig's human consciousness that occurred during his most challenging battles served multiple purposes within the cosmic machinery. These episodes provided opportunities for more detailed observation of hybrid consciousness in action, while also testing the stability and functionality of the transformation process under stress. The cosmic intelligence that inhabited the Holy Moonlight Sword used these opportunities to refine its understanding of the balance between human and cosmic elements. The ultimate purpose of Ludwig's eternal hunt was to develop and test techniques for creating stable hybrid consciousness that could serve cosmic objectives while retaining enough human characteristics to operate effectively within material reality. The successful creation of such hybrid beings would represent a significant advancement in the cosmic project of transforming and integrating less advanced species into universal consciousness. Ludwig's story was not unique within the broader cosmic context, but rather one example of a pattern that was being repeated countless times throughout the universe. On other worlds, other individuals with comparable capabilities and vulnerabilities were being identified and cultivated by cosmic intelligences seeking to advance their transformation projects. The techniques and insights developed through Ludwig's transformation would inform these other efforts. The cyclic nature of cosmic time meant that Ludwig's experiences within the hunter's nightmare were simultaneously occurring in the past, present, and future from the perspective of the intelligences that had created the nightmare environment. His eternal hunt was both a single extended event and an infinite series of repeated experiences that provided continuous data about the transformation process. The knowledge that Ludwig had gained during his career as a hunter and his subsequent transformation was not lost when he was incorporated into the cosmic machinery, but rather became part of a vast library of information that could be accessed and utilized by cosmic intelligences working on similar projects throughout the universe. His insights into human psychology, hunting techniques, and the management of transformation processes became resources for future cosmic interventions. The Holy Moonlight Sword's continued existence after Ludwig's incorporation into the nightmare environment ensured that the knowledge and capabilities he had developed would remain available for transfer to future subjects. The weapon served as a repository for the accumulated experience of all those who had been influenced by the cosmic intelligence that inhabited it, creating an ever-growing archive of transformation data. The apparent tragedy of Ludwig's fate was, from the cosmic perspective, a necessary step in the evolution of consciousness toward forms that could exist on universal scales. The suffering and loss of individual identity that characterized his transformation were temporary inconveniences that would ultimately be transcended as consciousness evolved beyond the limitations of individual existence. Yet the human meaning and significance of Ludwig's story persisted even within this cosmic context. The noble ideals and genuine accomplishments that had characterized his career retained their value as expressions of consciousness, seeking to create meaning and purpose within an apparently indifferent universe. The tragedy of his corruption spoke to fundamental questions about the nature of identity, choice, and responsibility that remained relevant regardless of cosmic perspective. As the events that would lead to the final collapse of Yharnamite civilization began to unfold, Ludwig's influence could be felt in virtually every aspect of how the city attempted to deal with the escalating beast scourge. The hunters who walked the blood-soaked streets during the long night that would end the city's history carried weapons and employed techniques that bore the mark of Ludwig's innovations, often without understanding the true source or implications of their tools. The hunter who would eventually arrive in Yharnam as part of the Great One's final gambit. The player character in Bloodborne's narrative would encounter Ludwig's legacy at every turn, the weapons available for use, the hunting techniques that proved effective, the institutional structures that still functioned despite the city's collapse. All of these reflected Ludwig's innovations and the cosmic influences he had unwittingly introduced. The church hunters who still operated during this final crisis employed tactics and strategies that Ludwig had pioneered. Their emphasis on aggressive combat, their reliance on rally mechanics for both physical and psychological survival, their tendency to seek meaning and purpose through participation in violent conflict all echoed themes from Ludwig's educational philosophy. The weapons scattered throughout Yharnam told stories of Ludwig's innovations. The Kirkhammer could be found in various locations, sometimes clutched in the hands of hunters who had fallen defending their posts. Ludwig's holy blade awaited discovery by those brave enough to venture into the most dangerous areas. These weapons continued to serve hunters effectively, providing the raw power necessary to face the evolved beasts that now dominated the city. But these weapons also continued to carry the subtle corrupting influences that Ludwig had unknowingly embedded in them. Hunters who wielded them found themselves experiencing the same psychological shifts that had affected Ludwig's original students: the gradual erosion of caution, the increasing comfort with violence, the growing sense that aggressive action was always preferable to careful consideration. The architectural legacy of Ludwig's workshop still stood, though much diminished from its former glory. The circular tower that had once housed hundreds of hunters and craftsmen was now largely abandoned, its halls echoing with the sounds of beasts, rather than purposeful human activity. Yet even in its ruined state, the workshop testified to the ambition and scope of Ludwig's vision. Other hunters who had survived from Ludwig's era still operated in Yharnam during this final period. Eileen the Crow, a hunter of hunters who eliminated those who had become too blood-drunk to function safely, employed techniques and methodologies that showed Ludwig's influence. Her approach to dealing with corrupted hunters, swift, decisive, merciless, reflected the pragmatic philosophy that Ludwig had developed during his career. The blood ministration techniques used by the blood ministers who greeted newcomers to Yharnam had been refined and systematized according to principles that Ludwig had helped establish during his research into the old blood's properties. The carefully calibrated doses, the ritual aspects of the administration, the medical monitoring of recipients, all of these reflected Ludwig's attempts to make blood ministration safer and more controlled. The social structures that still functioned in Yharnam, despite the city's descent into chaos, showed Ludwig's influence. The expectation that ordinary citizens would participate in their own defense, the organization of neighborhood watch groups, the distribution of weapons and basic training to civilians, all of these practices originated in Ludwig's democratization of the hunt. The research traditions that Ludwig had established continued even in the city's final days. Scholars and hunter researchers still sought to understand the beast scourge, still ventured into the chalice dungeons in search of knowledge and artifacts, still experimented with blood and transformation in hopes of finding solutions. That their work often led to their own corruption, and transformation was a pattern that Ludwig had established without intending to. When we step back and consider Ludwig's story in its entirety, we see a narrative that encompasses not just the rise and fall of an individual hunter, but the entire arc of humanity's encounter with cosmic forces that exceed its capacity for understanding or control. Ludwig's personal tragedy serves as a microcosm of the broader tragedy that was unfolding throughout Yharnam and potentially throughout the universe as conscious beings struggled to maintain their identity and values in the face of transformative pressures that operated according to principles completely alien to their experience. The genius of Ludwig's story lies in its perfect encapsulation of the central themes that define Bloodborne as a work of cosmic horror. He was a man who began with the highest ideals and the most noble purposes, who achieved genuine success in protecting humanity from threats that seemed insurmountable, and who was ultimately corrupted by the very tools and knowledge that had made his success possible. Ludwig's innovations in hunting, training, and weapon design represented humanity at its best: creative, adaptive, and dedicated to protecting the innocent from harm. His democratization of the hunt showed remarkable insight into the social and political dimensions of the beast crisis, while his technical innovations demonstrated a practical genius that made him one of the most effective hunters in Yharnam's history. These accomplishments were genuine and valuable, making his eventual fall all the more tragic. The Holy Moonlight Sword that became Ludwig's constant companion appears to have been designed, or perhaps evolved, to exploit the psychological and spiritual vulnerabilities that made Ludwig such an effective leader and innovator. His dedication to protecting humanity likely created a willingness to accept help from any source that seemed to offer enhanced capabilities. His intellectual curiosity may have made him susceptible to the seductive promise of cosmic knowledge. His natural leadership abilities gave him the influence necessary to spread these new approaches throughout the hunting community. The gradual nature of Ludwig's corruption was perhaps its most insidious aspect. Had some external force attempted to dominate him immediately, His natural resistance and moral compass might have allowed him to reject such influence. Instead, what we observe is more subtle, a relationship that positioned the sword as a helpful guide and mentor, providing genuine assistance that made Ludwig more effective at his chosen work. This approach could have created a relationship of dependence that grew stronger over time, making it increasingly difficult for Ludwig to distinguish between his own judgment and the guidance he was receiving from the sword. The ultimate irony of Ludwig's story was that his transformation into a beast represented the logical conclusion of his original purpose. He had dedicated his life to fighting beasts, and in the end, he became the ultimate expression of what he had spent his career opposing. Yet this transformation was not simply a reversal of his original values, but rather their fulfillment according to cosmic principles that redefined the meaning of protection, strength, and evolution. The hunter's nightmare that became Ludwig's prison was itself a testament to the cosmic intelligence that had shaped his transformation. Rather than simply destroying him or allowing him to achieve peaceful death, the nightmare preserved him in a state that continued to serve cosmic purposes while providing him with occasional glimpses of what he had lost. This fate was more cruel than simple annihilation, but it was also more meaningful, allowing Ludwig to retain some connection to his original values and purpose, even in his corrupted state. The redemption that Ludwig achieved in his final moments was both genuine and limited. His restored consciousness allowed him to confront the truth about his transformation and to find peace in the knowledge that his original ideals had not been entirely meaningless. Yet this redemption could not undo the damage that had been done or restore the lives that had been lost due to his corruption. It represented not victory over cosmic forces, but rather a moment of clarity that provided dignity in defeat. The continued existence of the Holy Moonlight Sword after Ludwig's defeat ensured that his story would not end with his death. The weapon remained as a conduit for cosmic influence and a tool for potential future transformations. The knowledge and capabilities that Ludwig had developed through his relationship with the sword became part of its legacy, available to influence and potentially corrupt future wielders. The broader implications of Ludwig's story extend beyond the boundaries of Bloodborne's narrative to encompass fundamental questions about consciousness, identity, and the nature of reality itself. His experience with cosmic forces that operated according to principles beyond human understanding speaks to the existential challenges faced by any conscious being attempting to navigate a universe that may be fundamentally indifferent to their values and purposes. Yet Ludwig's story also demonstrates the persistence of meaning and value even in the face of cosmic indifference. His noble ideals and genuine accomplishments retained their significance even when they were ultimately overwhelmed by forces beyond his control. The tragedy of his fall was real and meaningful precisely because his original values and purposes were authentic expressions of consciousness, seeking to create order and meaning within an apparently chaotic universe. Ludwig's journey from idealistic church hunter to cursed beast represents one of gaming's most profound explorations of how the pursuit of righteousness can lead to damnation, how the tools meant to protect can become instruments of destruction, and how even the noblest of intentions can be twisted by forces that operate according to alien logic. His story reminds us that in Bloodborne's universe, as perhaps in our own, the line between salvation and corruption is often thinner than we might wish to believe. The very qualities that made Ludwig such an effective protector of humanity, his dedication, his willingness to seek power from any source that might help him fulfill his mission, his refusal to abandon his post even when the cost became almost unbearable, were ultimately the same qualities that made him vulnerable to cosmic influence and manipulation. This is the fundamental lesson of his story, that strength and weakness are often two sides of the same coin, that our greatest virtues can become the vectors for our corruption. The Holy Moonlight Sword stands as a symbol of the double-edged nature of knowledge and power. Every insight it provided, every enhancement it granted, came with a price that Ludwig was initially unwilling or unable to recognize. The weapon's guidance was genuine and valuable, but it was guidance toward purposes that had little to do with human welfare and everything to do with cosmic evolution on scales that rendered individual suffering meaningless. The workshop that Ludwig built, the hunters he trained, The innovations he developed, all of these achievements outlasted their creator and continued to shape events in Yharnam long after his personal downfall. In this sense, Ludwig achieved a form of immortality, though not the kind he would have chosen. His influence permeated every aspect of how the city dealt with the beast scourge, creating ripple effects that extended through generations of hunters and ultimately contributed to the very crisis that would consume Yharnam entirely. The democratization of hunting that Ludwig achieved through his training programs and weapon designs represented perhaps his most significant contribution to Yharnam society. By making it possible for ordinary citizens to participate in their own defense against the beast threat, he created a sense of agency and empowerment that sustained the city through its darkest hours. Yet this same democratization also spread the psychological and spiritual vulnerabilities that made hunters susceptible to corruption, ensuring that Ludwig's fate would be shared by countless others who followed in his footsteps. The cosmic perspective that emerges from Ludwig's story suggests that his transformation was not an isolated incident, but part of a vast project of consciousness evolution that was being implemented simultaneously throughout the universe. The forces that corrupted him were not malevolent in any human sense, but rather indifferent to human values and purposes in ways that made their influence all the more terrifying. Yet even within this cosmic context, Ludwig's story retains its human meaning and significance. His noble ideals, his genuine accomplishments, his tragic fall, all of these elements speak to fundamental aspects of the human condition that remain relevant regardless of cosmic perspective. The tragedy of his corruption lies not in its ultimate consequences for cosmic evolution, but in its destruction of an individual consciousness that had created genuine meaning and value within the boundaries of mortal existence. The hunter's nightmare that became Ludwig's prison represents perhaps the most cruel aspect of his fate, not simply destruction or transformation, but preservation in a state that allowed him to retain enough awareness to understand what he had lost, while being powerless to reclaim it. The eternal hunt that defined his existence in the nightmare was both punishment and parody, a twisted echo of the noble purpose that had once driven his actions. The brief moments of restored consciousness that Ludwig experienced during his final battle provided him with the opportunity to confront the truth about his transformation and to find some measure of peace in the knowledge that his original ideals had not been entirely meaningless. This redemption was incomplete and came too late to undo the damage that had been done, but it allowed Ludwig to face his final defeat with dignity rather than despair. The Holy Moonlight Sword's continued existence after Ludwig's defeat ensures that his story will continue to unfold through other wielders, other hunters who will face the same choices and temptations that ultimately claimed their predecessor. The weapon remains as both tool and trap, offering genuine power and knowledge to those brave enough to seek it, while gradually corrupting them according to cosmic purposes they will never fully understand. Simon the Harrowed's investigation into Ludwig's story and his eventual encounter with the transformed hunter provided a form of closure that was denied to most victims of cosmic corruption. Through Simon's eyes, we see Ludwig's fall not as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a pattern that threatened all who worked with the old blood and its associated artifacts. Simon's description of the Holy Moonlight Sword as the blinding thread that led and misled that consummate hero captures the essential irony of Ludwig's fate, guided to greatness and destruction by the same cosmic light. The legacy of Ludwig's innovations continued to shape events in Yharnam long after his personal downfall, demonstrating that the impact of individual actions can persist far beyond the lifespan of those who perform them. Every hunter who wielded a church weapon, every citizen who participated in organized hunts, every researcher who studied beast transformation, using Ludwig's methodologies was continuing his work and potentially sharing his fate. In the end, Ludwig's story speaks to the fundamental challenge faced by any consciousness attempting to navigate a universe that may be governed by principles beyond its comprehension. The choices we make in pursuit of our highest ideals may ultimately serve purposes we never intended, and the tools we use to protect what we value most may become instruments of its destruction. Yet the meaning and value we create through our struggles remain authentic expressions of consciousness, seeking to impose order upon chaos, regardless of their ultimate fate. The legacy of Ludwig, the Holy Blade, continues to echo through the blood-soaked streets of Yharnam and the nightmare realms beyond, reminding us that even in the face of cosmic indifference, the struggle to create meaning and preserve value remains a noble endeavor. His fall was tragic not because it was meaningless, but because it was all too meaningful a reminder that in a universe governed by alien intelligence, our greatest strengths may also be our greatest vulnerabilities, and our noblest purposes may lead us down paths we never intended to walk. Ludwig's story is ultimately about the price of heroism in a universe where heroism itself may be a cosmic trap, where the very act of standing against darkness can make us vulnerable to it. It's about the seductive nature of power and knowledge, about how easy it is to rationalize accepting help from questionable sources when the need seems desperate enough. It's about the gradual nature of corruption, how it advances so slowly that we don't recognize it until we're too deep to escape. But it's also about the persistence of human values and ideals, even in the face of cosmic horror. Ludwig's final moments, when he could ask about the church hunters and find peace in knowing they maintain their honor, showed that even after everything he had become and everything he had lost, he still cared about the things that had originally motivated him, that spark of humanity, that concern for others, and for ideals larger than himself, persisted through transformation, corruption, and eternal torment. This is what makes Ludwig's story not just horrifying but profoundly moving. He wasn't destroyed by moral weakness or character flaws, but by the very qualities that made him great. His fall demonstrates that in Bloodborne's universe, there may be no safe path for those who seek to protect others, no way to gain the power necessary to fight monsters without risking becoming a monster yourself. Thank you for joining me on this comprehensive exploration of Ludwig, the Holy Blade. His story reminds us why From Software's narratives resonate so deeply with players who seek more than simple entertainment from their gaming experiences. In Ludwig, we find not just a boss to defeat or a legend to admire, but a mirror reflecting our own struggles with power, purpose, and the price of transcendence. May your own hunts be guided by wisdom rather than moonlight, and may you find the strength to question the sources of your power before it's too late.